was 21 when this happened. It was 2017, and at the time, I was working part-time at a gas station a few towns over from where I lived. It was one of those jobs I only planned to keep for a few months, just until I figured out what I wanted to do next. The shifts were usually easy, a lot of ringing up snacks and cigarettes and stuff like that, more so than the occasional person paying for gas and cash. During the day, it was annoying but normal. The nights were different. The nights dragged. The place felt too bright inside and too dark outside, and every customer felt a little stranger. That night, I was working the closing shift by myself, and I still think about it all the time. The store closed at midnight. Around 9 or 10 at night, the phone started ringing. I answered without thinking anything of it. The second I picked up, I heard this weird voice. It was low and drawn out, like someone trying to sound like a killer in a horror movie. It reminded me right away of Ghostface from Scream. It sounded really forced, like someone trying to do an impression, but yet it was still unsettling. The voice asked if I was all alone in the store. I just stayed quiet for a second, then said something sarcastic like, "Yeah, you got me," and then I hung up. I figured it was one of my friends messing with me. I texted the group chat and asked which one of them was calling the store pretending to be a serial killer. They all found it funny and acted confused at first. One of them asked what I was talking about, then another said he was at home. I assumed they were just lying because that would have been the obvious response if they wanted to keep the prank going. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was that same fake horror movie voice. This time they asked why I hung up. I once again sarcastically said, "All right, you got me." The voice let out this soft laugh that sounded weirdly real, not playful like I expected. Then it said I shouldn't be rude to people who know where I am. I hung up again, but this time I felt a little off. It was probably still a joke, but there was something about how calm the person sounded that got me. I kept trying to shake it off. Customers were still coming in at that point, enough to keep me distracted. People getting gas, buying beer, and getting lottery tickets. But every time it slowed down, I found myself looking at the phone. It rang a third time around 10:40. I answered, and I immediately regretted it. The voice asked if the store always got this quiet that late. That got under my skin more than I want to admit. I said nothing and hung up. After that, I texted my friends again, this time more seriously. I said it was getting old and asked who was doing it. Again, they all denied it. I started messaging them one by one. It was the same thing. One was with his girlfriend, one sent me a picture from his basement, one was apparently at a friend's house almost half an hour away. At that point, I started getting annoyed instead of scared. I thought maybe they had someone else doing it, but the truth was, even though the caller never said my name, he was saying things that matched what was happening in the store, like how quiet it was. Around 11, the calls started coming closer together. I stopped answering after the fifth one. The phone would ring and I would stare at it and let it stop on its own. Then a minute or two later, it would ring again. That went on for maybe 15 minutes. I started checking the cameras more. There were a few around the outside of the building and a few inside. The store sat by itself off a road that got pretty dead at night. There was a small patch of woods behind one side of the building and an alley-like area where the dumpster was. The outside cameras weren't great. They had blind spots and the picture at night was grainy. Still, I kept flipping through them, half expecting to catch one of my idiot friends crouched outside laughing. I didn't see anyone though. Then I started hearing little sounds outside, which at first I told myself was nothing. For example, a tap somewhere. Then what sounded like a light scrape near the sidewall. Then a noise by the back that sounded like someone stepping on loose gravel. It got to a point where I couldn't dismiss it any longer. I texted the group chat again and told them to seriously stop. I even sent a picture of the empty store and wrote that this wasn't funny anymore. They kept denying it. One of my friends actually called me from his normal number and I told him what was happening. He sounded genuinely confused and said he wasn't joking, nor was he involved in any joke. He told me to lock the door early if I had to. I didn't want to do that unless I really felt I needed to. Part of me still thought I was making too much of it. At around 11:40, one last customer came in. I remember the exact sound of the door opening because it made me jump. I looked up and saw just a regular-looking guy at first, maybe late 20s or 30s. Nothing outwardly crazy about him. He wasn't dirty or dressed weird. He just had this blank expression. He didn't say hello, he just walked in and started moving through the aisles. I watched him on the cameras while pretending not to. He took way too long for someone who ended up buying one bag of chips. He kept drifting to different aisles and then stopping. More than once, I saw the top half of his face appear above the shelves while he looked toward the counter. Not in a casual way either. It felt like he was checking on me. I kept thinking maybe he was high or maybe he was tired, or maybe he was deciding what he wanted. but my stomach had that heavy feeling by then, like my body already knew something was wrong before my brain wanted to admit it. He was in there for at least 8 or 9 minutes. Then he finally came up to the counter with a bag of chips. He still didn't say a word, so I didn't either. I just took the chips and scanned them. When I looked down at the register, everything felt normal for 1 second. Then I looked up and caught him staring directly into my eyes. He held it for maybe 2 seconds. It doesn't sound long, but it was. There was no expression on his face when he did it. Then he looked down and paid. I handed him back the bag, and he turned and walked toward the door. I remember thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a weird guy. But right as he got to the door and pushed it halfway open, he stopped and turned his head back toward me without fully turning his body. His chin was slightly lowered, so his eyes had to look up at me. Then he smiled. I still don't know how to explain that smile without sounding dramatic. It looked like he knew exactly how creepy he looked, and he was doing it on purpose. It made every hair on my body stand up. Then he stepped outside, and instead of walking toward any of the pumps or toward a car, he walked around the side of the building. When he did it, he kept his eyes on me through the glass. He kept that smile too. I just stood there watching him until the angle cut him off. Then I rushed to the camera monitor and followed him there. I saw him round the building and head toward the side where the woods were. Then he disappeared into the blind spot behind the building. He didn't come back out. I waited maybe 10 seconds, then 20, then a minute. He never reappeared. That was enough for me to lock the door early, even though it was a little before midnight. This part might sound dramatic, but I texted my family and my friends and told them that there was a creepy guy outside and I wasn't joking anymore. I said if I stopped replying, that meant something probably happened to me because of him. I rushed through the closing stuff as fast as I could. I barely cleaned anything. I kept checking the cameras over and over, expecting to see him pop back out. Nothing. Midnight hit, and I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my stuff, turned off what I needed to turn off, and went to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped out, and that moment of having to relock it was so tense I couldn't have done it quick enough. Once I did, I took off running to my car. It was parked off to the side of the building. I got most of the way there, and just as I reached it and slowed for half a second, I heard fast footsteps. Not running, but worse somehow, like speed-walking steps slapping the pavement in front of the store. I turned and saw him. It was that guy. He had come from the front corner of the building and was moving toward me and my car fast. I yanked my car door open and threw myself inside. I locked the door and started the engine so fast I almost flooded it. The second the car started, I hit reverse and peeled out of that lot. I looked once in the mirror and saw him standing there in the lights watching me leave. The whole drive home, I was sending voice texts and regular texts to everyone saying I was right, that I knew he was going to come out of nowhere. None of that was a prank anymore. The next day, I texted my boss and told him exactly what happened. I said I wasn't doing overnights anymore. He looked at the footage later, and his response honestly made me even angrier. He got kind of defensive and said the guy looked like a regular customer to him. He said maybe I had just gotten spooked because of the phone calls and connected things that weren't connected. That pissed me off more than I can explain. I was the one there. I was the one getting the calls. I was the one who saw that guy disappear around the building and come speed walking at me out of nowhere when I left. I didn't care if the footage didn't fully capture how it felt because I knew what happened. I quit right after that. I didn't even argue much. I just told him if he thought that was normal, he could work the closing shift himself. I ended that job with attitude, and I was proud of it. Even now, many years later, I still think the caller and that guy who came in were the same person, even if I can't prove it. My name is Cadence. I work the closing shift at a small dive bar in the quieter part of my town. The place is right off the highway, but the parking lot also has a back entrance that's available to the general town. It's nothing fancy, just a dimly lit spot where the regulars know each other by name, and the jukebox has been playing the same rotation of classic rock for years. Most of our customers are locals, truckers passing through, and the occasional lost tourist looking for a stiff drink. I like it though. The routine is predictable, the tips are surprisingly decent, and I've learned how to handle the usual bar crowd. The talkers, the flirters, the quiet drinkers, and the ones who just want to be left alone. Weekends are obviously a lot more hectic, but the thing about working during the week is that I'm expected to work my night shifts alone. I don't even get a bar back to pop in now and again. Yeah, it's obviously easier work and slower during the week, but I miss the company of my coworkers. I tend to be pretty vigilant during my shifts because we do get the occasional bar fight considering the kinds of crowds we attract. That's why I clocked the guy immediately. It was sometime after 1 in the morning on a Tuesday when he walked in. If I had to guess, I'd say he was in his late 40s, but he was extremely clean cut and well groomed.
Not the kind of look you'd expect from a guy his age in an area like this. He was wearing a black turtleneck underneath a black trench coat, definitely well dressed, but casual about it. I'm not sure how to explain it, but he had this aura of sophistication about him that makes you think of money. Real money, not the loud look at me kind. He glanced around slowly before walking swiftly over to the bar and taking a seat. I also remember him having oddly good posture, but that's neither here nor there. When I walked over, he glanced at the bottles behind me and ordered something top shelf without hesitation. As I was pouring his drink, he asked me if I liked working here with a smile on his face. It was a normal enough question, so I answered him honestly. I told him yeah and smiled back. I then made a joke about being a bartender or something. I wish I could say I got a creepy vibe from him, but that's not the energy he was giving off. He genuinely seemed like a stand-up guy, kind of like the single dad at his kid's baseball game that gives the whole team a high five. He chatted with me for a bit, which I didn't mind since the bar was pretty quiet at that point. Eventually, he asked me if I ever thought about doing something bigger, which I admit was somewhat bizarre. Again though, not a totally creepy question given the nature of the situation. I gave him my standard bartender smile and told him I was happy for now. He nodded and sipped his drink, seemingly disappointed at my answer for reasons I didn't understand. After a long pause, he asked me what time I got off out of nowhere. That question surprised me. I hadn't picked up any kind of flirting from him whatsoever, so I was a little disappointed to discover that our conversation had just been another one of those empty attempts at getting my number. I smiled and gave him a vague answer, trying to brush him off in a friendly way without seeming uptight. Before he could answer, I busied myself and began wiping down the counter, but he didn't press. He just smiled like he already knew, then drained his drink and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, laying it gently on the bar like it was nothing. Then, without another word, he walked out into the night. I didn't really know what to make of the encounter. I know it sounds like nothing, but his demeanor was just so far off my radar that I was intrigued. Either way, I figured I was never going to see him again and got on with my life. As it would turn out though, I was wrong. About a week later, he came back. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him. She drew my attention since I hadn't seen her before. She looked like she was in her mid-30s and was dressed in a way that didn't quite match her age. Trendy, but off, like someone trying a little too hard to blend in with a younger crowd. I watched her closely as the two of them approached the bar. Everything about her seemed calculated, from the way she smiled too easily to the way she leaned against the bar like we were already friends. As I was setting down napkins in front of them, the very first thing she said to me wasn't a hello or a drink order, but a compliment. She put on this overly joyful smile and said, "You're so pretty." Her fingers brushed against my arm as she said it, lingering just a second longer than normal. I laughed and thanked her, but I could instantly tell that something was off about this woman. The man didn't speak, which I thought was also a little strange given that he had been so talkative last time. They ordered drinks and poured them, and that's when questions came flooding in. The woman asked me how long I'd been working here, along with how old I was and a bunch of other small talk questions like that. I answered in short, polite sentences, but I got the sense that this wasn't small talk. She was studying me. At one point, she looked over at the man, and it seemed like they were communicating despite not speaking. She looked back at me and told me that she ran an exclusive event club. She leaned in a bit as she said it, lowering her voice as if to prevent her being overheard by another patron. She told me that she's always looking for young, fun people for private parties, and that I'd make a killing, 10 grand for a weekend. I let out a small, forced laugh and told her it sounded too good to be true. She insisted that it was real, and told me that a bunch of girls like me worked for them. Her smile never faltered at any moment, which was starting to creep me out. She steered the conversation back to the job, circling around the same words. Fun, safe, exclusive. Then, casually, she said, "You should step outside for a second. There's someone who can explain it better." My pulse kicked up. I wasn't playing around at that point. I didn't even bother pretending like I wasn't creeped out. "I'm good," I said in a firm voice, no smile on my face this time. Just then, a group of customers walked in, laughing and talking loudly. The woman's expression changed in an instant, her friendly mask slipping just slightly before she turned to the man beside her. Without another word, they left. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't unsettled after that. Those random people had just propositioned me for God knows what. I told my coworkers and my boss about the situation, and we all agreed to keep an eye out should those people return. My boss assured me that he was always a 15-minute drive away should I need him, and the bar's security cameras were typically enough to deter any misbehavior. There wasn't really much I could do beyond that. It's not like those people had done anything illegal. I tried to push it out of my head, but a few nights later, after closing, I saw the car. It was parked across the street, engine off, just sitting there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin like static. As I walked to my car, I kept my head down, my keys clutched tight in my hand. When I pulled out of the lot, I checked my mirrors. The car followed. It stayed back just enough to avoid suspicion, but every turn I made, it was still there. I took a random turn onto a side street, and it followed. Another, still there. I started freaking out internally. I knew it was them. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. Then, without hesitating, I navigated and pulled into the parking lot of a police station, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles practically turned white. The second I pulled in, the car sped off. Nothing happened after that for a while, but I knew it wasn't over. It turned out I was right. It was a slow weekday shift, barely anyone coming in. By midnight, I was wiping down the counter, half thinking about closing early, when the door creaked open. It was the woman. I immediately sent my boss a text as inconspicuously as I possibly could. I looked back up, and the woman was staring at me with that same artificial smile. She walked slowly to the bar and sat down with her hands folded neatly. I was debating just telling her to leave when she said, "Thought I'd come check on you." My stomach started twisting, but I did my best to hide it. I told her we were about to close and that she had to leave, but she made this pouty face and asked for just one old-fashioned. I thought about denying her, but I figured pouring the drink would stall her long enough for my boss to arrive. So I turned around and got started, trying to keep my cool. And then I heard it. The soft, unmistakable click of the front door shutting. I whipped around. The woman was gone. I felt this awful pit in my stomach as I stepped toward the entrance. Through the glass, I saw it. A black van idling just outside. Without thinking, I locked the door as quickly as I could. But then, metal rattling from the back door. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't think. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could, a metal shaker, and clutched it like a weapon as I dialed 911 with my other hand. There was no way the police would get there in time, so I thought about making a run for it out the front door, but I didn't for whatever reason. I was bracing myself for a fight when I saw headlights pulling into the lot. It was my boss. The sounds on the back door suddenly stopped, and a few seconds later, the van pulled out of the lot with a screech. I embraced my boss and told him what had happened, and he said he had gotten the license plate of the van as it was leaving. When the cops arrived, my boss reviewed the security footage with them. It was worse than I had imagined. Just before the woman left, the cameras had captured two masked figures crouching near the front door, waiting. There was another person in the back who was banging on the door with his fist, clearly trying to flush me out to the front. It was downright horrifying. To make matters worse, the plate number my boss had caught turned out to be unregistered. It's been quite a while since this incident, but no progress has been made. The only good news to come out of the whole thing is that my boss doesn't make me work alone anymore. Despite that, I'm still extremely uneasy anytime I'm scheduled for a night shift. I still question how they knew I'd be working alone. It doesn't make any sense. Even now, I often think about what would have happened had I given into fear and run out the front door. I used to work the night shift at a gas station / convenience store off a quiet stretch of highway. I say used to because after what happened to me a few months ago, I won't work a night shift again. It's a small station, the kind that barely gets any business once it gets late. Most of my shift was spent restocking shelves, wiping down counters, and occasionally ringing up a trucker or traveler passing through. I remember the whole thing vividly. It was just past 2:30 in the morning. By then, even the truckers had mostly dried up, and I was left with basically nothing to do. I scrolled mindlessly on my phone, trying to kill some time. At one point, I stepped outside for some air, rubbing my hands together against the cold. I exhaled a few times, watching my breath disappear in the cold. The parking lot was empty, just the pumps, the road, and the dark stretch of trees beyond. The neon sign flickered faintly, and I remember it being hazy out, like you could literally see the moisture in the air. Even with the highway not too far off, it was pretty silent out there. Right as I was about to walk back towards the store, I noticed something move out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around and realized there was a person standing behind one of the pumps. How had I not noticed him earlier? He was wearing a dark red hoodie with a hood up, and he had both hands shoved in his pockets. There wasn't a car in sight, so he obviously wasn't fueling up. The only thing was, he didn't seem to be heading towards the store either. He was just standing there, half turned toward the store like he was watching me. At first, I figured maybe he was waiting for someone, but something about the way he moved rubbed me the wrong way. He was kind of shuffling about in this circular pattern. I entered the store, but made sure to keep an eye on him through the glass. I kept track of him while pretending not to, hoping someone would drive up and pick him up or something. But after a few minutes, he started walking toward the door. Slow at first, then suddenly pushing inside like he'd made up his mind all at once. He walked up to the counter, but didn't say anything right away, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. Then, in a rushed, almost rehearsed way, he muttered that his car had broken down just before the pumps. He said he needed a jump or maybe just a little gas to get to the next town. I was literally shocked. He wasn't even trying to make his story believable. Like, I couldn't believe he actually expected me to buy his BS story. I offered to call a tow truck instead. No, he said, too quick, shaking his head. He just needed a flashlight, maybe some help checking under the hood. Something was definitely off, that much was true. The way he spoke, the way he watched my reaction, it felt like a test. To be fair though, people walking into gas stations at that hour are usually a little strange, and I started wondering whether he actually needed help and was just an odd person or on something. I asked him where his car was parked, and he told me it was just beyond the highway entrance. I was obviously skeptical, but then he pointed at the monitor behind me. I turned to look at the screen, and to my surprise, there actually was a car parked out there. I thought to myself, oh crap, maybe this guy really does need help. And that's when it hit me. I had literally just been outside, and I would have remembered a car parked out there. I glanced back at the monitor, and saw the slightest movement near the car's back bumper. Someone was crouching just out of view. A cold wave of dread hit me. I forced a casual smile and agreed to help the guy, but not before telling him I needed to grab my phone from the back office. I turned slowly, not wanting to spook him, but the second I was out of his direct sight, I slammed my hand onto the emergency panic button under the counter. The alarm went off instantly, screeching through the store. I expected him to attack me, but what he did instead was even more unsettling. His nervous energy disappeared. No more fake urgency, no more shifting from foot to foot. He actually relaxed. His whole body language shifted, and then he smiled. Not a panicked smile, not an embarrassed one either. A slow, knowing grin, like he had all the time in the world, like this was amusing to him. I was in shock. I didn't even have time to get physical with him. In one fluid motion, he turned and bolted. I ran to the monitors just in time to see both of them take off. Not toward the car, but into the woods behind the station. The car just sat there, engine off, headlights off. No one inside. By the time the police arrived, it was exactly as I saw it. The car was still there, but the men were gone. No footprints leading away, no sign of them anywhere. And then one of the officers pointed something out. Something I hadn't noticed before. The front passenger door was open. There had been a third person inside the whole time. The police took my statement down, I turned over the surveillance footage, and that was that. A few days later, they followed up with me. They had the car towed and ran the plates. Turned out, it had been reported stolen nearly a week earlier, over 100 miles away. No one had come forward to claim it, no reports of missing persons, no other crimes linked to it, just an abandoned vehicle in the middle of nowhere with no explanation. That was months ago, and still nothing. I don't know why convenience stores are such popular targets, but I can say for sure that I will never work another night shift again. This happened a couple weeks ago. I worked the night shift at Walmart. It's not the worst job in the world, but after a while, it starts to feel like you're just floating through time. The nights blend together. Same shelves, same routine, same dull hum of the overhead lights. Hopefully something better comes along. I usually hang out in and stock the electronics section, which is nice because it's quieter than the other areas. People don't exactly come rushing in at 2 a.m. to buy phone chargers and Bluetooth speakers. Most of the customers are either night owls killing time or truckers grabbing last-minute supplies before heading back on the road. That's why I noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another guy wandering the aisles, probably waiting for someone. But after a few minutes, I realized he wasn't shopping. He wasn't even pretending to. He just kept appearing. Every time I glanced up, he was lingering nearby, hovering in the next aisle over, or standing a little too still by the clearance section. He wasn't looking at anything. He was just standing there, watching me. I told myself I was overthinking it. The store is big, and maybe he was just taking his time. But the way he moved, always just close enough for me to notice, never actually picking anything up, it set something deep in my gut on edge. I was waiting for him to just get on with it and ask for my number, but he never approached me. It was like he wanted me to see him, which didn't make any sense to me. I went to radio someone about it, but realized that the batteries in my radio must have been dead because it wasn't working. Eventually, I started debating whether I should go find a manager when I felt a hand wrap around my arm. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but before I could react, a woman's voice rang out loud, friendly, overly familiar. She exclaimed, "There you are," before going on a little spiel about how she had been looking all over for me. I turned, completely thrown off, and saw a woman I had never seen before in my life. She was smiling, her grip firm on my arm, like we were old friends reuniting. Before I could say anything, she leaned in and whispered, her tone dropping to something low and urgent. "That guy's been recording you. Follow me." My stomach dropped. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance back. The man was still there, only now, he wasn't even pretending to browse. He was staring right at me. A cold wave of fear crept over me. I let her pull me. I didn't even question it. The way she grabbed my arm, the way she spoke so loud and casually, like we were two old friends reuniting, I clung to it. I was beyond grateful that someone had realized what was going on and put herself in an uncomfortable position just to help me. She kept up the act as we walked, rambling about something, maybe a trip she had taken, maybe an inside joke we supposedly shared. I barely processed the words. My thoughts were stuck on him. Had he really been recording me? That was creepy as hell. I wanted to know if he was still following us, but I couldn't muster the courage to turn around just yet. The woman steered me through the aisles, moving fast. I barely noticed where we were going, only that we were going, that the distance between me and that man was growing. In all honesty, I was kind of expecting her to quit the pretending to know me at some point, but she kept it up. At one point, it was getting a little uncomfortable, so I glanced behind me, and to my relief, that man was no longer following. The woman kept pulling me forward, though. I told her that we were good now and that we should probably go find my manager, but she just squeezed my arm tighter, telling me that he was lurking somewhere. I thought to myself, so what? What's he gonna do in a store full of employees? I was obviously worried at first because no one was around, but now that I wasn't alone, I started realizing that there wasn't much of a point in being scared anymore. I told her this, but she continued moving. I told her I was serious and planted my feet, twisting my arm slightly to loosen her grip. "You can let go now," I said, but she didn't. She smiled at me, but something in it was off. "Come on, just a little further," she said, basically tugging me at that point. I glanced around. The store was basically dead. We had moved past the registers, past the self-checkout, past the aisles that saw the most foot traffic. The warehouse section loomed ahead, dimly lit and nearly empty. Beyond that was the side exit, the one without cameras, the one employees used for loading shipments. That's when it dawned on me. She was leading me straight to the exit. I didn't think. I screamed for help as I yanked my arm free of her grasp with all my might. She lost her grip just enough for me to pull free. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran toward the front of the store. As I fled, she yelled out something behind me. She yelled for me to come back, followed by my name, which I hadn't given her. I kept running until I saw one of my coworkers who was running toward me, most likely reacting to my screaming. I told him to call security, which he promptly did. That woman was long gone, though. By the time I told my story to the security guards, that woman and that man were nowhere in sight. They reviewed the security footage, and just as I suspected, the woman and man walked into the store together. She had been with him the entire time. The man's face was clear as day in one of the frames, but hers was always turned away. I had a feeling she was the mastermind behind the whole thing, so I was infuriated that the cameras hadn't picked her face up. Every second of it had been planned. The police got involved, and the whole thing went down as a failed abduction attempt. I'm still waiting for a resolution about it. That man should definitely be easy to track down, given his face was caught on camera. I have no idea how that woman knew my name. That's what terrifies me the most.
Those people hadn't just picked me at random. I was a direct target. I've been sitting on this story for a while now. It happened back when I was in high school. I'm in my 30s now for context. Also, I'm going to refrain from using my real name and all my friends' real names in the story. You can look up the place I'm about to describe online, and I don't know if we'd still get in trouble, so it's best to avoid real names just in case. In my hometown, there used to be an abandoned military base. From what I saw online, it was used primarily during the Cold War and World War II. At one point, over 200 military families were housed there. It looked like a small community. I'm sure military bases all across the country have these small communities, but it still seemed weird to me. The village was abandoned in 1984, and it was just left that way until 2014, when it was finally torn down. I remember growing up as a kid, we would always hear ghost stories about the abandoned village. I had heard every type of story you can imagine. Everything from demonic cults gathering there, to top-secret military experiments being performed deep underground. Anybody who lives in this area knows all about the abandoned village. It was almost like a lost piece of local lore. When I was in middle school, I remember my older brother coming into my room one night when I had my friends over, and he told me that they had been to the village. We didn't believe him. He described in detail what he saw. He looked genuinely scared, but I'm sure that was just part of him messing with us. He started telling us about the church and how the church had a secret door on the floor next to the altar. He told us that he could hear moans and screams coming from the church basement. After laying it on thick for a while, he finally had all of us believing him. His irrational story just added to the already mysterious lore of the abandoned village. For years, my friends and I would share stories about this place. We always said that once we were old enough to drive, we would investigate it ourselves. All through high school, we talked about exploring the village, but never went through with it. That was for two main reasons. One, we didn't really know the exact location of the village. We knew the area, but that wasn't enough to go on. We knew it was near the airport, but there's a lot of area around the airport that has no trespassing signs. And two, even though it was abandoned, it was still technically a military base. We had no idea what kind of trouble we'd be in if we got caught. On one cool spring night in our senior year of high school, one of my friends, Alex, came to us and told us that he knew where the entrance to the village was. We didn't believe him. He told us that someone he knew had been there and shared the location with him. I was so confident that he was making it up that I told him we should go and investigate. I assumed that we would never find the entrance, so that night, around 11 p.m., we made the 15-minute drive to the approximate area. Alex didn't seem confident of the location. He kept telling me to pull over. Every 2 feet, he'd say, "I think this is it," but it would just turn out to be nothing. Finally, we found an overgrown road. Alex claimed that this must be the path. There was a beat-up, old no trespassing sign covered by a bunch of trees. Since we had my car, I started to get nervous about going any further. Alex and my friend Nick were 100% down to keep driving forward. Getting in trouble wasn't even on their minds. They kept going back to the same argument. We'd been talking about it basically our whole lives, so let's finally do it. They eventually talked me into it. I started to slowly drive down the dirt road. I turned the lights off on my car and basically just let the car roll down the dirt path. We eventually came to one of those roadblock gates that go up and down. Obviously there was nobody at the security checkpoint, so I had to get out of the car and manually lift the gate. This is where it started to get weird. The next minute or so of driving, we could see a bunch of furniture littered on the side of the road. Beds, dressers, tables, basically anything you could think of. Then we got to another roadblock gate. This time I had Alex get out and lift the gate. After that final checkpoint, we were in the village. It was a surreal feeling. After all the years of hearing about this place, we were finally there. It looked like being in the Upside Down from Stranger Things. It was like a small neighborhood, but it just looked wrong. You could see that it was decaying. I pulled the car in front of the church. We all got out and quietly started to explore the area. The first thing I noticed was that there were no cameras anywhere that I could see. That made me feel a little better that maybe we wouldn't get caught. We went to the church first, and it was creepy. There was graffiti everywhere. I looked for the door my brother mentioned when I was a kid, and it was no surprise that there was no trapdoor. After exploring the church, we went and looked at some of the houses. It was so creepy. It was legitimate housing, and it just looked completely abandoned. Some of the housing units looked like they'd been hit by a hurricane, while others were still intact.
The housing that was intact was more creepy than the messed up units. Our friend Scott was with us, and the entire time he was freaking out. He kept claiming that someone was there. Scott was always afraid of something. We kept telling him that it was just because of the nature of what we were doing, and that his imagination was probably playing tricks on him. While in one of the houses, we all stopped abruptly because there was an unnatural sound. What I mean is that it didn't sound like a typical noise a house makes. I asked my friends if they had heard it, and they all had. It sounded like wood creaking, like the sound it would make if someone were walking on the wood. Instead of continuing to listen, Alex shouted asking if anyone was there, and the noise stopped. We all stood in that house for a minute trying to talk about what we had just heard. I truly didn't know. Alex and Nick were sure that it was just an old abandoned house making noises, not Scott. He was sure that we weren't alone. Either way, I told the group I wanted to leave. I had such an uneasy feeling being there, and I just wanted to go home. I could tell Alex and Nick wanted to stay. Since I drove, I told them that we were leaving. While we were heading to the front door, Scott jumped back suddenly. He quietly pointed to one of the windows on the side of the house. 3 shadows can be seen moving on the outside of the house that was next door. We all became dead silent. Those were clearly the shadows of heads that were moving just outside the window. As quietly as I could, I stepped over to the window and looked outside. I could see the shadows move just out of sight into the backyard of the house we were inside. I whispered as quietly as I could that we needed to make a run for the car. Everyone nodded. Without thinking, we all just sprinted right out the door and in the direction of my car. Once the car was in sight, Scott, who was in front of us, screamed at the top of his lungs. We all looked, and standing next to the back seat of my car was a tall woman with a disgusting old black dress on. She had the back door open, and it looked like she was about to get into the vehicle because one leg was already halfway into the back seat. When she heard Scott scream, she let go of the door and ran inside the church. We continued running towards the car. When we got there, I looked in the back seat, and thankfully, nobody was back there. We got into the car and drove off as fast as we could. I remember going so fast that I lost control on the dirt and almost crashed the car. That night, we shared stories about who we think we encountered. The most obvious answer is that those people were likely homeless in some capacity and using this abandoned facility as a shelter. All of that makes sense, except for why that woman would be trying to get inside my vehicle. It's also terrifying when I think about that night because we walked around for quite a while and never saw anybody, or even a clue that somebody had been there. Not until right before we left. Even though Scott claimed that he heard something weird, I still think that was just his imagination at that time. Years later, I started telling my girlfriend the story. She said we should look it up and see if it's still there. That's when I realized that it had been torn down in 2014. It's wild that there's so much more information on it now. Growing up, we constantly tried looking stuff up about that place, and there was nothing. Because of that, it added more to the mysterious lore of the abandoned village. I'm just happy we left when we did, and that Scott screamed when he saw the tall woman. If we had been 10 seconds later running to the car, who knows how this night could have ended. When my wife and I first started dating, we were reckless. Not in a way that harmed anyone directly, but we did some things that I would never do now. Things of questionable legality, in other words. For example, we would explore abandoned buildings and houses trying to find proof of ghosts. I never bought into any of that stuff, that was more of her deal, and I just went along with it because I liked the girl. Out of all the houses and buildings we explored, only one time was I left at a loss for words. I couldn't explain then what I saw, and I don't think I can explain now what I saw either. It was an extremely dark night outside, one of those cloudy nights that just makes everything feel so much darker. She had found this house that was not near anything. It was an old house that barely looked like it was standing. I was always sketched out to go inside these houses, not because I was scared of ghosts. I was sketched out to go inside because I never knew if these houses were going to collapse when I was inside. This house was in particularly rough shape. I had to kick down the front door, which was boarded up. Inside the door was what I assumed used to be a living room, except it was missing half the floor. In the middle of this room was a giant hole where the floor used to be. We took our flashlights and looked down the hole, and you could see what was left of a basement. I kept telling her that we should probably leave because this place clearly isn't safe. She didn't care. She kept telling me just to wait a minute. That was always her go-to line whenever I wanted to leave. She was sneaking around the house watching for holes, and I just stayed by the front door. I told her I was staying there because I didn't trust the floor. She laughed and called me a coward. A few minutes went by, and my curiosity got the better of me. I made my way into the other room where she was. The room was a mess, junk stacked to the ceiling. She was going through all the stuff, trying to find remnants of the people who lived there. That was part of her routine. I wanted no part of that. She told me to check the upstairs. She must have known I didn't really want to do that, because before I could even respond, she said that the sooner we search the entire house, the sooner we can leave. Reluctantly, I made my way upstairs. At any moment, I was sure I was going to fall through the floor. There was a room directly to the right at the top of the stairs. I went in there first. It was an old bedroom with a bed still in there. It was kind of depressing. The bed was still made, and on the bottom of the bed was a folded up bathrobe. It was like somebody just disappeared and left their home as is. I continued looking around the room, and it was just more junk everywhere. A lot of clothes, some old knickknacks that were falling apart, and furniture that looked like it might break if you touch it. There was this weird crawl space in the corner of the room. Sometimes we'd find treasure in these crawl spaces. I went inside, and it was weird. It was filled with a bunch of baby stuff, like unopened boxes of diapers and baby food. But the stuff was old, like really old, and covered in dust and cobwebs. Some of the baby food had clearly been gone through by rodents, not to mention it smelled horrible. Just as I was about to leave, I thought I could hear the sound of creaking. I used my flashlight to look around the entire crawl space. In the corner of the crawl space was another little opening. I couldn't believe I missed it a second ago. I crawled over and looked down the opening. It was a narrow path that looked like it went directly across the length of the house to the other bedroom. The creaking sound was clearly coming from down that way. I was a little too big to crawl down the narrow path, so I left the crawl space and started heading toward the other bedroom from the top of the stairs. The other bedroom was down the hall and to the left. As I got closer, I could still hear the creaking sound. It was getting louder the closer I got to the bedroom. My heart was racing, but not because I was scared. I was completely ready to be jumped by a horde of raccoons. When I was just a couple of feet away from the doorway, the sound was clear. I quietly walked through the doorway, and I almost fell over. A woman was sitting in a rocking chair, staring out the window. I didn't say anything at first. The back of the chair was facing me, so I could only see the top of her head and what looked like a long skirt on her legs. Slowly, she just rocked back and forth. I was trying to see the reflection of her face in the window, but it was just too dark to make out any details. I took one step toward the woman, and the floor creaked. Once she heard that noise, she instantly stopped rocking. I started to apologize and told this woman that we didn't know someone lived there. Before I could say anything else, she started to rock again, almost like she was completely unfazed that I was standing there. For some reason, instead of running, I took another step forward and asked if the woman was okay. As I took that step, she stopped rocking again. Then she stood up slowly. When she was standing in front of the rocking chair, I heard her voice. She didn't say anything. Instead, she just made this noise. It was like a low hum. Then, out of nowhere, she quickly turned around to face me. It made me jump, and I turned around and ran. I wish I could describe what I saw, but it happened so fast that I didn't really see any details of her face. All I could tell was that she was old and her skin looked wrinkled. I ran downstairs screaming that we needed to leave. I tried telling my girlfriend that we weren't alone and that somebody still lived there. She just laughed. She was so confident that I was messing with her. I was pleading with her that we needed to leave, that someone was upstairs in the bedroom. Instead of listening to me, she wanted to see for herself. I begged her not to go upstairs, but she didn't listen. I was screaming at this point to please leave, and she just continued to ignore me. I followed her upstairs and watched her make her way to the bedroom at the end of the hall. When she got to the doorway, I heard her say, "Oh my God." I ran to the end of the hallway just in case, and as I got to the doorway, she just started to laugh. Inside the room was the rocking chair, but no woman. She asked if I was scared of the rocking chair and continued to laugh at me. I told her that there was a woman there just a minute ago, but she just kept laughing at me. She went into the room and looked all around. There was no old woman. I swore to her that I saw an old lady, but she just continued to laugh at me. She walked by me and left the room. As she walked away, she said we could leave. We were both walking towards the stairs, and then we both heard it. The creaking sound again. The sound of the rocking chair going back and forth. She looked at me and froze. There was no doubt about it. It was clearly the sound of the chair. She mouthed the words to me, "What is that?" as we both stood at the top of the stairs. She took a few steps toward the bedroom and could hear the woman humming. It was like she was humming a melody. She got to the doorway and saw with her own eyes the rocking chair with someone sitting on the chair and humming to herself. She didn't engage with her. She just turned and ran, and we both ran out the door after that. She started screaming once we got to the car. She kept asking what the hell we just saw, and I didn't say anything. I wanted to look back at the house as we drove off and look at the window to see if I could see anyone standing there, but I was too terrified. I truly have no idea what we encountered that night. Maybe I really did have a brush with something paranormal. I know how unlikely that is, but who knows? Maybe that kind of thing really does exist. I suppose it could have easily just been a very old woman who still lived inside a filthy and decomposing house, but I don't fully buy that. I mean, the door was boarded up, and there was a giant hole in the living room. Not exactly ideal living situations. Not long ago, I brought this story up to my wife and asked her if she remembered. She obviously did. We drove to the abandoned house, and it had been torn down. There was no house there. Not even any remnants of a house. I try to replay that night in my head all the time. I try to remember what I can about that woman's face. I tell myself that it was just an old woman, but something in my gut tells me that's not the case. When I was in middle school, my family and I moved to a new house. It was an awesome house to be a teenager in. It was bigger than our last house, and the neighborhood was filled with a lot of kids my age. Just about everything was great about this new place, except for our one neighbor. It was the classic mean old man. We would go outside and play two-hand touch football, and if we even got within a couple of feet of his front yard, he would go crazy. He'd start banging on the window and screaming from inside the house that we need to get off his property, even though we never actually went onto his front yard. As an adult, I understand the feeling of unwanted kids on your property. The difference in this situation is that we were good kids and respected his wishes. That didn't matter. As we'd walk outside, he would instantly start banging on the window and yelling at us to get away from his house. It was like he was watching for us all the time. It was brutal. This went on for about 6 months after moving into the new house. One day, we noticed that he had stopped banging on the window. We didn't hear him or see him. I remember joking that he must have died. Why else would he finally leave us alone? Another month or so later, my friend Joel stayed overnight. We woke up in the morning when it was still dark out. I don't recall the exact time. We heard a bunch of commotion coming from next door, and we could see siren lights shining through the window. We got up and looked out the window, and right at that moment, we saw 2 people bringing out a zipped-up body bag. We knew right away what we were looking at. I remember feeling a little messed up by this. I'd seen this thing a million times in movies, but never in real life. I'll never forget that feeling of guilt. We were joking about this guy dying, and he really did pass away. I couldn't stop thinking to myself that he must have died over a month ago, and they just now found him. I didn't know that for sure, but something in my gut told me that was the case. After the old man's death, the house remained empty. Well, not completely empty. I guess the correct answer would be abandoned. All the old man's stuff remained in the house, and the house just lay uninhabited for years. Apparently, the old man did have one son, but he lived in another state and didn't even bother to come back after his father passed away. It's actually sad when you think about it. Over the next few years, I would sometimes stare out my bedroom window and just look inside the abandoned house. His house was directly next door, and from my bedroom window, you could clearly see into the house. It was so creepy. Knowing that this guy died somewhere in there always gave me the chills. For the next few years, I would always joke around with my friends. I would tell them that the place was haunted. My friend Joel, the one who witnessed the body bag with me, was one of those guys who was always scared. Every time I had people over to the house, I would tell Joel that I'd seen the old man's ghost. He would cover his ears and tell me to shut up. Everyone would always laugh. I enjoyed being a troll in high school, especially when I had an audience. One night, Joel had enough of the trolling. He dared me to go inside the abandoned house. I didn't love the idea of breaking into the place, and that's what I told him. Joel started to troll me now, calling me a coward and a few other choice words. I thought about it for a second, and I honestly didn't think it would be that big of a deal if I took a quick stroll through the old guy's house. It had literally been empty for a few years at this point. Nobody would even notice if I broke in. I made my way over to the house. I tried to walk inside, hoping that maybe the door was unlocked. Of course, it wasn't. I tried kicking the door down, but I weighed about 130 pounds at the time, so the door was not budging. Next to the front door was a small window. I tried to pry it open from the outside, but to my surprise, it wasn't locked. It slid open easily.
I looked back one time just to make sure nobody was watching me enter the house through the window, and then I entered. The first thing I noticed when I entered the house was the smell. It literally smelled like death. I started to gag. I had to put the collar of my shirt over my nose. In addition to the smell, it was creepy in there. Everything was exactly how this old guy had left it. In the living room next to his recliner was a book with a bookmark still in the middle of the book. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's where the smell was the worst. If this guy had been dead for a while in the house, like I thought before, I was thinking that he probably died in the kitchen. He had a small table in there, with a sweater on one of the back of the kitchen chairs. In front of that chair was a coffee mug. The stove had dusty pots and pans on the burners. I checked to see if something was in them, but they were empty, except for a lot of dust. I left the kitchen and entered a narrow hallway. The first room to the left was the room I was able to see from my bedroom. I entered the room and looked out the window. All my friends were in the window waving at me. Joel looked shocked that I was still inside. While I was waving back at them, I heard a loud bang come from the other side of the house. It wasn't subtle either. It literally sounded like a person banging into the wall. I stood completely still. I was trying my best to focus my hearing, but there was no follow-up noise. I looked back at my friends, and they looked confused, almost like they didn't know why I was just standing there. I was creeped out now. Just the weirdness of this entire situation had me feeling off. Even though there was still more of the house to explore, I was all done. I quickly made my way to the door, unlocked it, and let myself out. When I got back inside my house, I told my friends about what I saw and how terrible the smell was. We talked about it for a little while, but ultimately, we moved on quickly after that. That night, after we all fell asleep, Joel woke me up. I asked what he wanted, and he told me he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing weird noises from next door. I dismissed him right away and told him to go back to bed. I tried telling him that his mind was playing tricks on him because of what I told him about the noise. He didn't say anything. In that quiet moment, I heard a weird noise. Joel perked up and told me that's the noise he kept hearing every few minutes. I admit, it was weird. It was like two loud knocks. I sprang up and looked out the window toward the old man's house. It was dark, and I could barely see anything. Joel looked terrified and asked what was standing in the doorway of the old man's room, the room I had been in earlier. It looked like a silhouette of a person. I dismissed it at first, telling Joel it had to be a coat rack or something. Then Joel became erratic. He screamed no way. He swore that he had just seen the silhouette move. His erratic behavior woke up my other friends. They all looked out the window and agreed with Joel. I told them that there was no way a person could be standing there. Obviously, there was some type of shadow or something else that we just couldn't explain. While we were arguing among ourselves, Joel screamed again. This time he didn't say anything, he just pointed. I looked out the window, and now standing directly in front of the old man's window was a figure. Whatever it was, it had moved from the doorway to the window. It was still too dark to make out any details, but because of where he was standing, you could clearly see now that it was a silhouette of a person. We all started to freak out. We had no idea what we were looking at. While I was watching this figure, it started to move. I was able to see it walk back towards the doorway until it completely faded back into the darkness. I continued looking out the window for several more minutes, but nothing happened. I had no explanation for what happened. I remember telling my friends at the time that it must have been just the old guy's son finally coming back to the house. It was the only thing I could do to get my friends to somewhat calm down in that moment. We spent the rest of that night constantly looking out the window every few minutes, but we never saw anything again. It was about a year after that I finally met the old man's son. He showed up with a dumpster and gutted the entire house, then he sold it right after. My dad talked to the guy for a while, and he told my dad that he had a horrible relationship with his father. It took him years to finally get to the house and sell it. To this day, that is still the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen with my own eyes. I'm happy that I had several witnesses with me that night who all saw the same thing as me. I know sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, so it's validating to have other witnesses who saw the same exact thing. My friends and I still try to get together once a year, even though we all live in different states now. Every time we're together, the story comes up again. I have no idea what I saw in that old man's abandoned house that night. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for what we saw, but I just have no idea what it is. I grew up in North Pennsylvania in a small town called Wellsboro. It's surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was a big deal there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half the town would be out in the woods. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12, and by the time I was 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember because there was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 a.m. while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards out, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Around 8 a.m., I saw movement near that stand. At first, thinking it was a deer, I was dead wrong when I saw it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't in camo. He was wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still, and he was looking in my direction. I didn't know if he saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't say it was a friendly, smiley wave, more so a wave like he was just letting me know he saw me. I gave a small wave back, thinking maybe he was just another hunter who didn't have proper gear. After maybe a minute, he stepped behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away, but he didn't come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the woods, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and maybe still hunt a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed, except for my own tracks walking in. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, expecting maybe he climbed it, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of snow on it that didn't look disturbed. That made no sense. I remember feeling my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed something tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a strip of orange hunting vest material tied in a knot. I was thinking maybe someone marked a trail, but then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. That was the first time I considered just leaving. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale like he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick, until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He didn't say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he didn't answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast.
In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time they weren't just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground, but the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I don't condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way like markers, or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly, like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just didn't stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore either. Definitely not in grounds I'm not familiar with. Anything can happen when you're all alone out there, yet not actually alone. This story takes place in November of last year when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company, so when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go. I will say, I personally don't like hunting, but I love to camp, and I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not? I love exploring new places. So I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long dirt road through the woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father built it and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see that. It was so peaceful inside the woods I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked dinner for the night. Everything seemed normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a scratching noise coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing. We didn't see anything for a couple hours, so we decided to take a nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look at the tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the whole time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa. He looked through his binoculars, and right then, a herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about and that it was just wildlife. I was irritated to say the least. I know what I saw, and it looked like someone, or at least something.
After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we needed to head into town to get some supplies. So we hung the deer up and left for the store. When we got back, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our ARs and went out scouting. We were talking for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again. The second it realized I noticed it, it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to yell for my grandpa, so I did a light whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the woods with his gun raised and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa okay, but he told me the coyote noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice. We sat there for a moment before we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense heavy footsteps and heavy breathing coming from behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and breathing right outside the door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple times. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple times. It must have heard whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Kyle had been asking Connor and I for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and somehow look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before and almost never saw anyone else. I'm being honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was this: we would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, so I'll do my best to use hunting terms and whatever. Connor agreed to the trip because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like a good story later. I agreed because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO is strong with me sometimes. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk without making as much noise, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we got to the area he wanted, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school stuff, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a tent. It was a rare, honestly amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened like a dog, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said foxes can make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. I wanted the fox thing to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed as before. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time, it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away, if that. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Then Connor called out, asking if someone needed help out there. I said that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stared into the woods and listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen yet. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered. Then he said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. He didn't say why, but it was obvious. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles nearby. I barely slept that night. Every little noise my brain picked up on. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and cold enough that I didn't want to leave the sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of the tent. Right away though, I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and one of the coolers had been turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had definitely been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung everything properly, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek and on a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably wasn't that much farther in. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up, but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon, even he had settled down. There's something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood, whether you wanted to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I only heard the crack of the rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable work. Once we got there, he started field dressing it and then showed us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. Side note, I grew up an animal lover because of my parents, so the idea of me going on a hunting trip was already kinda crazy. Kyle was in his element though. He explained every part of it like he was teaching a class, and by the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because I think Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. That wasn't our originally planned dinner. It was just a celebratory meal, if you'd call it that. I have to admit, it tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a fun close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than that first scream the night before, but the second I heard it, I felt an uncomfortable feeling inside me. Like, this again? We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us the way it had the first night. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it look even blacker. I remember the feeling that whoever was making that sound could probably see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything at all past the trees, and that made me uncomfortable.
Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear it in his voice that he cursed under his breath. Then, in this weird burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and I think because all three of us had been drinking enough that our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last, because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside of the edge of camp, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I think we all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light left was a weak little glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We got into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, of course. I could hear little sounds from the woods, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was inventing. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running, fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was terrified that it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still for the last time. That silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore in a normal sense. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. All these sounds were so amplified, it felt like so much was going on. The footsteps got farther and farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in the shaky voice I had never heard from him before. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent and that there was no way we were staying in separate tents after that. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle just said he didn't know flat out. Hours passed like that. Every so often, one of us would think we heard movement and everyone would go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off at some point. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple things were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans had been stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road again, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air, like one of the Tatooine warriors from Star Wars. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, they would have answered us either night when we yelled back. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs or someone trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who the actual knows what the explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I could see a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help, and the way she looked right at me gave me chills, even now. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains, and wondering what that dream was about, if it was my brain telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all of that, there really had been a person out there and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on.
This happened when I was 15 years old. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I wasn't old enough to get many on-the-books jobs, so I would occasionally babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and found an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. The post explained that she worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep before I arrived and would remain asleep most of the night. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like an easy job. I emailed the woman and got a response about an hour later. She asked for my phone number and called me that evening, and she sounded completely normal. She spoke calmly and answered all my questions. She explained that she had to leave for work before I would arrive, so she would hide a key outside the house. She told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before agreeing to anything. The woman spent several minutes speaking to my mom on the phone. Whatever they discussed seemed to satisfy my mom because afterward, she told me it sounded like a great idea. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by large trees. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed every light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked to the front porch and checked the hiding spot the woman had described. The key was exactly where she said it would be. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. After setting my backpack down, I turned around and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. Inside was a pretty standard house at first glance. There were family photos on the walls, and a few toys sat near the living room couch. I saw a pink backpack leaning against a chair. There were kids' drawings attached to the fridge with magnets. Everything seemed ordinary. Still, I wanted to know the layout of the house, so I walked through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway leading towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. What I was not expecting to see was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window looking out it, but that fact quickly made the sight more unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing to look at. I stared for several seconds before finally speaking. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was a smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth were missing. I asked who he was, and his smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed out of the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She answered after a few rings, and I explained that there was a man in one of the bedrooms. She sounded confused for a second before acting like she suddenly remembered. That part of it really still sticks with me. Then she explained that it was her brother who had dementia and sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he's harmless. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. If her brother was living there, he should have been mentioned in the ad or on our phone call. Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there for another minute just contemplating my situation. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing remained open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me nervous. I continued farther down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one. Locked. I tried the second one. Locked. The third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The room appeared empty. I couldn't see much because the lights were off. I pushed the door a little farther. It was just an empty room. Feeling stupid for being scared, I continued toward the guest room. As I passed the fridge again, I noticed something strange. The drawings attached to it looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of the drawings had dust sitting on top of the magnet holding it in place. The backpack I'd seen earlier looked faded too. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually been in that house was. The thought made me uncomfortable. I realized that despite being there for almost half an hour, I still hadn't seen a single sign that Rose currently lived there. I hadn't heard her, and I hadn't seen her room. I hadn't even seen any recent toys. I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a small room. I set my backpack on the floor. Then I noticed something. There was no lock on the door. As I turned around to look back into the hallway, there was the man again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He was looking at me again, and his smile came back on his face. I hadn't heard him approach. It was like he just teleported there. I honestly don't know how long he had been standing there. The missing tooth was visible even from where I stood. For several seconds, we stared each other down, me looking at him like he was some confused animal and not even an actual person. Then I quickly stepped inside the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm myself down. I knew well of dementia from a young age, as my great-grandmother passed away with dementia. This allowed me to justify this man's actions. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. I called my mom 3 times until she finally picked up. I told her of the situation I was in, from the unannounced brother with dementia to the fact that I couldn't even find the child in the house. For a few moments, she was silent. Then she told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing that made me feel relieved and scared at the same time. Scared because even my mom thought something was up here. She hung up after she said she'd be there as fast as possible. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer until they stopped directly outside the door. Everything went silent, and I stared at the doorknob. I checked my phone, and the woman still hadn't called back to see if everything was okay. I decided to call her myself, but after 3 attempts, she never picked up. While I was waiting, the bedroom door opened a few inches. I couldn't see who was standing outside. The opening wasn't wide enough. I sat there staring at it. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was on the other side didn't enter. I knew it had to be the brother. It was those final, tense seconds where I decided I was getting out of there, and I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I crossed to the other side and kept going. I ended up nearly a block away before finally slowing down. I pulled out my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, a text message appeared. It was from the woman's number. The message simply asked where I was going. I immediately looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside or at the windows. I didn't see any cameras when I entered the house, yet somehow she knew I had left. That was when I became convinced something was seriously wrong. I called my mom and told her not to come directly to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, she pulled up. I jumped inside and locked the door, and we left immediately. Neither of us ever contacted the woman again. I never figured out who the man really was. I never figured out if Rose actually existed. I never figured out why all the bedroom doors were locked. There's a slight possibility that it was all real and that I was just extremely paranoid and dipped out, but the chances of that are slim to none. Something weird was going on in that house. When I was 15 or 16, I got a summer job cleaning units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through the property manager, who I used to babysit for, and for a high school student, it paid surprisingly well. The job was simple. Whenever a tenant moved out, we would go in and clean the unit to prepare it for the next family. Many of the units had been abandoned in a hurry. Belongings were often left behind, and some places looked as if people had simply gotten up and left one day. I worked alongside a university student I'll call Jen. She was about 20 or 21 and naturally took the lead while I followed her direction. One day, we were assigned a unit on the end of a row. The layout becomes important, so I'll explain it briefly. When you entered through the front door, you walked into the living room. On the right side were 2 sets of stairs, one leading up to the second floor and one behind a door leading down to the basement. The basement stairs turned twice, meaning you couldn't see into the basement from the main floor. The basement itself was just one large unfinished concrete room with a washer, dryer, furnace, and a single hanging light bulb. There were no closets, side rooms, alcoves, or places to hide. When we entered the unit, it was obvious the previous tenants had left in a hurry. The kitchen was filthy and most of their belongings were still there. We spent the first part of the afternoon packing everything into garbage bags and sorting items that could be donated. Once that was finished, we started cleaning. Part of the kitchen cleanup involved pulling the oven and fridge away from the walls and cleaning them thoroughly. We also removed the drawer underneath the oven.
When it came time to put it back, we discovered the rails were damaged and it wouldn't slide in properly. For reasons that made sense at the time, Jen and I stood on opposite sides and kicked it until it wedged itself back underneath the oven. When we tried pulling it out again, it wouldn't budge. We both immediately regretted doing that, but we figured the property manager could deal with it later. After that, we split up. Jen headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms while I stayed downstairs removing the glass light fixtures so I could wash them. I was standing on a ladder in the living room when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I called back, to no response. I climbed down and went upstairs. When I found Jen, she was cleaning a bedroom with headphones on. I asked what she wanted. She looked confused. "What, did you call me?" I said. She laughed and shook her head. "No." I shrugged it off and went back downstairs. One thing that always bothered me about that unit was the attic access above the staircase. It was just a square opening in the ceiling leading into a dark crawl space. The cover was missing, so every time I walked underneath it, I found myself looking up into a square of complete darkness. A few minutes later, I heard my name again. This time when I called back, Jen immediately yelled from upstairs, saying, "I didn't call you, you're hearing things." At the time, I agreed with her. It was strange, but I wasn't frightened. Not yet. A little while later, I was standing at the kitchen sink cleaning the light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge and nearly tripped. The oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the floor. Immediately, I thought it was odd. Jen and I had practically kicked the thing into place. We'd also confirmed afterward that it was completely stuck. Still, I just kicked it back in. It took several hard kicks before it wedged itself under the oven again. To make sure, I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing, it was stuck. Satisfied, I went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I turned around again and almost tripped. The drawer was back out. I hadn't heard anything. Nobody else was downstairs. This time, I felt genuinely unsettled. The drawer hadn't simply slid out. It had been jammed into place. I left it where it was and decided it was the property manager's problem. When I checked on Jen, she was still upstairs cleaning, so I returned to my own work. Eventually, I started reinstalling the clean light fixtures. Since it was a bright summer afternoon, I turned the lights off while I worked. I was standing on a small ladder trying to secure one of the fixtures when the lights suddenly switched on. The sudden brightness startled me, and I fell backward on the ladder. A second later, the fixture slipped from my hands and came crashing down. It narrowly missed hitting me in the head. For a few seconds, I just sat there on the floor. I could see the light switch from where I had fallen. Nobody was near it. At the same time, I could clearly hear Jen moving around upstairs. Only a few seconds had passed. There was no possible way she could have run downstairs, turned on the light, and gotten back upstairs. The switch had somehow turned on by itself. At least that's what it looked like. I still wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I was just uncomfortable. At that point, I decided I was done working alone and went upstairs to find Jen. When I told her what happened, she looked uneasy. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. A few minutes earlier, she thought she'd heard someone call her name too. It didn't sound like me. We were both officially creeped out. The only task left was sweeping the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down there alone, so we went together. The basement was exactly as I described earlier. One large open concrete room with nowhere to hide. While Jen swept, I sat on the dryer and talked with her. A few minutes later, we finished and headed back upstairs. We were relieved to be almost done. We started gathering our supplies in the living room. I was standing maybe 2 feet from the open basement door when it happened. From below us came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Both of us froze. The footsteps were loud enough that neither of us questioned what we were hearing. Then came something far worse. The footsteps suddenly broke into a run. They were charging up the stairs, fast and loud, coming directly toward us. The footsteps got louder. I looked at Jen, and her face had gone completely white. Neither of us said a word. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the basement door and slammed it shut as hard as I could. Then Jen and I ran. We flew out the front door and across the lawn. At one point, I heard Jen yell behind me, "The key!" I yelled back, "Leave it!" Neither of us stopped until we were on the other side of the complex. I barely remember what happened afterward. Eventually, we returned to the property manager and told her someone had been inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and never went back. As far as I know, she contacted the police before anyone entered the condo. We never told her what we had actually experienced. What could we say? That something invisible had spent the entire afternoon calling our names? Moving objects around? Turning lights on and finally charging up the basement stairs? It sounded ridiculous. Even now, I'm not someone who believes every strange story is paranormal. I've had other experiences in my life that could probably be explained one way or another. This one is different though. Maybe we imagined hearing our names. Maybe there was some mechanical explanation for the oven drawer. Maybe the light switch malfunctioned. But that basement was empty. There was nowhere for anybody to hide. And those footsteps weren't distant or ambiguous. They sounded exactly like someone running up a staircase directly toward us. Even now, more than 20 years later, hearing someone run up a set of stairs sends me right back to that summer afternoon. I'm still a skeptic, but I never have been able to explain what happened in that condo. When I was younger, I was a hustler and a go-getter, always looking for the next way to make a quick buck, and my mom knew an older couple from a church group who needed help around their property for a couple of weeks. Their names were Richard and Elaine, and they were both in their late 60s, old but not super old. They lived in a pretty rural area about 40 minutes away from my house. They were in one of those older farmhouses with a long gravel driveway and woods behind the property. The deal was simple, but I would stay there for a little over a week, help Richard with yard work, cleaning out the garage, moving furniture, painting a fence, things like that, and they would pay me at the end. My mom trusted them because she knew Richard from years back, and Elaine seemed really sweet the first time I met her. She was quiet, but she smiled a lot and kept asking if I was hungry. The house itself was fine. It was what you'd expect an elderly couple to live in a quiet area. Upstairs at the end of the hall was the room I'd be sleeping. On my first day there, Richard showed me around the property and then gave me a verbal list of things we'd work on, and Elaine made dinner. I noticed early on that Elaine didn't talk much, but she always had a neutral to half smile on her face. She asked my name 3 different times, to which Richard just said she forgets things sometimes. I figured he meant normal old person forgetfulness, so I didn't think much of it. That night, I went upstairs around 11 and tried to sleep. Sometime around probably 3 in the morning, I woke up and heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking back and forth outside my room. I knew it. The floorboards creaked every few seconds. Maybe Richard was going to the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't go anywhere. They just passed my door, went down the hall, turned around, and came back. I laid there in the dark listening to it for maybe 10 minutes, and it got increasingly uncomfortable until they seemed to stop right outside the door. I stared at the big, dark gap under the door, and I felt like I could see the outline of 2 feet. After a while, the footsteps moved away again, which confirmed that what I was seeing was in fact 2 outlines of feet. The next morning, I mentioned it to Richard while we were outside working. He didn't look surprised. He just said Elaine sometimes wandered at night because she had bad dreams and got confused, and that I shouldn't worry about it. When I asked if I should lock my door at night, he kind of laughed and said the guest room didn't have a lock because the house was old, so I let it go. But the second night was worse. I woke up again to the same footstep sounds, except this time they were faster. I could hear Elaine muttering to herself in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard my name once, which gave me goosebumps. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times. I was starting to hate that large gap under the door. The doorknob twisted, stopped, and the door opened about an inch. It stayed open a crack for just a moment, and I heard a whispering voice through the crack, but I couldn't make out what was said. Then the door shut again. After that, I had trouble sleeping, like I think anyone would in my shoes. In the morning, I told Richard exactly what happened. Once again, he explained it away. His explanation was she probably thought the room was empty and that she had been doing things like that more lately. He said it was embarrassing for her and asked me not to bring it up around Elaine. During the day, she seemed mostly normal, doing things like making lunch, folding towels, and watering plants, which made the whole thing harder to process. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room with this flat, suspicious look. It was like she didn't recognize me, but also didn't like that I was there.
On the fourth day, Richard and I were cleaning out a shed behind the house. I noticed a dented metal walker shoved behind some boxes, and next to it was a broken picture frame with dried brown stains on the glass. This is kind of important for later. Later on that same day, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long scratch on the hallway wall, about chest height, like something had been dragged across it. There were also small holes in one of the doors downstairs, like someone had hit it with something. These all seemed like signs of struggle. That night, I put my suitcase in front of my bedroom door. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone, but I figured it would at least make noise if the door opened. Around 2:30, I woke up to the sound of the suitcase scraping across the floor. I looked and saw my bedroom door was halfway open. Elaine was standing in the doorway in her nightgown. I saw her mouth hung open as she was heavily mouth-breathing. I said her name, trying not to sound scared, even though the sight was horrifying. When she stepped into the room, that was when I saw she was holding a kitchen knife at her side. She walked closer to the bed and started whispering something, which I quickly was able to understand as, "You don't belong here." She said it like 5 times. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." She came all the way to the side of the bed and stood over me with the knife hanging in her hand. I yelled for Richard as loud as I could. Elaine flinched like the sound scared her, then she turned and marched out of the room. Even the stiff way she marched out of the room was terrifying. She slammed the door and marched away. Richard came upstairs maybe 30 seconds later, acting annoyed, like I had woken him up for no reason. I told him she had been in my room with a knife. He kept saying she wouldn't hurt anyone and that she wasn't herself that night. This was officially when him downplaying her behavior began to piss me off. I said I wanted to go home, and he replied it was 3 in the morning and my mom was probably asleep. He said we'll talk about it in the morning. I should have called my mom right there, but I didn't want to make the situation bigger. I pushed the dresser in front of the door after he left and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, Elaine acted like nothing happened. She made pancakes and was smiling again, giving normal grandmother vibes. Richard pulled me aside and apologized, but it didn't feel like a real apology. He said Elaine's memory had been getting worse, which sounded like an understatement. When I asked him if she had ever attacked anyone before, he took a pause, then he said she had gotten upset with a caregiver once, but that it was handled. That was the first time I realized he had definitely been hiding things from me. I told him a second time that I wanted to leave. He said he understood, but my mom was at work until late and he would drive me home the next morning after we finished one last job and they paid me. That afternoon, while Richard was outside on the phone, I went looking for my backpack because I wanted to pack early. For some reason, I found it in the laundry room. On my backpack, there was a blood stain clear as day, right on the outer pocket. I called Richard into the room and showed him the blood. He grabbed the backpack, looking a little more angry than I'd seen yet, and he told me he accidentally cut himself earlier and moved my backpack in there while he cleaned up the blood. He finished it off with a "stop worrying." I told him I was calling my mom, and he once again tried to get me to calm down. I went upstairs, packed my bag, and tried calling anyway. The call failed twice, so I texted her to come get me, but it didn't send. Richard also refused to give me the Wi-Fi password. That was when I really started to feel trapped. I had to tank through until she came the next morning. The final night, I didn't even get in bed. I sat fully dressed on the top of the blanket with my shoes on and my bag next to me. I moved the dresser in front of the door again, but around midnight, Richard came upstairs and told me to move it because it was dangerous in case of a fire. I refused at first, and for the first time, I heard him yell. He told me to move the dresser now. I complied and moved it just enough so the door could open. After he left, I waited in the dark with my phone in hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elaine downstairs. She was yelling this time. It sounded like she was yelling at Richard. Then I heard glass break. Richard said her name, trying to calm her down, and then there was a loud thud, followed by him shouting in pain. It sounded like she just attacked him. I got up and cracked my door open. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from the staircase from downstairs. Footsteps started coming up the stairs fast. I shut my door and pushed the dresser back as hard as I could. A few seconds later, Elaine hit the door from the other side. The doorknob rattled violently. She started saying again and again that I didn't belong here. She sounded furious. The door shook as she hit it again and again. and I heard something metal strike the wood, and a piece of the door splintered inward. My sights landed on the window, my only exit, and I decided I was jumping out. I could hear Richard downstairs groaning and calling for her. Whatever she did to him, she was about to do to me, maybe worse. I got the window up and kicked out the screen. There was a small roof over the porch below the window, so I climbed out onto it with my backpack. Elaine was still banging on the door when I jumped out. I dropped from the porch roof into the bushes below. I ran down the gravel driveway without looking back. I could hear the front door open behind me, and Elaine was yelling from the porch. She was holding what I could only guess was a fireplace poker in one hand. I kept running until I reached the road, where I finally was able to call 911 with service. The police and an ambulance showed up maybe 15 minutes later. Richard had a cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to stop her. Elaine was taken away by paramedics. The police got a hold of my mom, and she arrived as soon as she could. Richard later told my mom that Elaine had been getting worse for months, but he didn't want to put her in a facility because he felt guilty. He thought Back in 2023, I experienced one of the most unnerving and scary nights of my life. I can't explain what happened. I never liked staying home alone, but after this night, I don't think I've ever stayed overnight anywhere alone since. At the time, my fiance Ryan and I were looking to buy a house since our lease just expired in our apartment, and we didn't want to renew for another whole year. One of my dad's oldest friends owned a house in the area that was currently available to rent because the previous renters had passed away. Since my dad was so close to the owner of the house, he agreed to let us stay there for a cheap rate, and also told us we could stay as long as we wanted. Basically, we were renting month to month in a nice home in a beautiful area of town. It took a lot of house hunting stress away. The only downside for me was that I wasn't thrilled about moving into a house where both residents died within a few weeks of each other inside the house. They were old, so it wasn't like a vicious death or anything, but still, I didn't love the idea. It didn't bother Ryan at all. He was excited about the low price tag of the house. He's not one to believe in bad energy, but I most definitely am. I remember when we first moved in, he would constantly mock me for being afraid. He even went as far as to mimic ghost sounds just to mess with me. Don't get me wrong, Ryan's a great guy. I know I'm painting a picture of him being a jerk, but he's always just joking around. Sometimes you need to knock him down when he plays around too much, and I always did. When we first moved in, it had this awful tan carpet all throughout the house. My dad's friend told us that he was having someone come over to tear out the carpet and put in hardwoods because the carpet was stained all over the place, on top of just being ugly. In the living room, there was a giant dark stain on the carpet. The first day we moved in, Ryan asked my dad's friend if he knew where the stain came from, and he shared information I wish I hadn't heard. It's really sad. The woman fell, hit her head on an end table, and the stain was from the blood. They think that was what led to her passing. She went to the hospital that night, and unfortunately, she never came home. Then he proceeded to tell us that her husband had passed away just a few weeks before her. He had a heart attack in the basement. I was horrified to be living in this house, even just temporarily, but sometimes you need to do what's most cost efficient, and this was it. We had only been there for maybe 2 days when they came to do the floors. I was so happy when the carpet was gone. He also had someone come in and paint the inside of the house. Just that little touch-up made the house feel so much better. After those little cosmetic touches, I started to settle in. It also helped that he added one of those annoying security systems inside the house as well. Every time you open the door, you get the automated voice saying, "Front door open." It got old very fast. Even though it was annoying, it did make me feel better. It was a little over a month of being there, and Ryan was leaving for the weekend. It was his bachelor party. I was a little on edge about being alone for a couple of nights, but by this time, the house felt like a home. I also had the company of our cattle dog, Rex, which made me feel safe. Friday, July 7th, I left for work at 7 a.m. I kissed Ryan goodbye because he was heading out a few hours later and wouldn't be back until Sunday afternoon. I got home that evening and felt a little off. I was positive that I was just feeling anxious because I was alone. I ordered myself Thai food since Ryan hates it and it's my favorite. I put on The Office and just watched my feel-good show until I started getting tired. I think it was close to midnight, and I began to hear this weird noise coming from the basement. This was an older house, so I just kept telling myself that the house is creaking. I turned off the TV and started heading into the bedroom. That's when Rex ran to the basement door and started barking. This was not normal behavior for Rex. He was protective but quiet. He didn't really bark a lot. He mostly howled when he would get vocal. But on this night, he was barking. He sounded tense, like something was wrong. I tried consoling him, but he wouldn't calm down. I don't know why I did this, but I slowly opened the basement door and turned the light on. Rex stopped barking and started to growl. I was gonna go down and just make sure everything was okay, and then I remembered that the old man died down there. I know it sounds crazy, but that freaked me out. I felt frozen at the top of the stairs. I couldn't even look. I tried taking a picture of the basement from the top of the stairs, but it was just too dark down there to see anything. I was too scared to go down there myself and look, especially with Rex losing his mind. I shut the door and went to the bedroom. Eventually, Rex calmed down and joined me in the room. He wasn't barking or growling anymore. Instead, he stayed at the bottom of the bed staring at the door all night. It was like he was on high alert. This scared me more than his barking. I slept horribly that night. I expected someone or something to run into my room at any moment. I made my coffee in the morning and got ready for the day. I planned on catching up on some chores around the house that I had been neglecting. I gathered all my laundry, and when I made my way to the laundry room, I freaked out. This may seem small and trivial to some, but it freaked me out like you can't even believe. The washing machine was sticking out from the wall several feet. Not just a little wiggle, this thing was nearly in the middle of the room. At first, I ran out of the room. I couldn't figure out how or why something like that could happen. Once I composed myself, I went back to the washer and checked it out. Other than being in the middle of the room, nothing else seemed out of place. I moved it back to where it was, and it wasn't easy. This was a heavy unit. I felt like I should have heard it moving. Even though I was completely on edge, I continued with everything I had planned for the day. I called Ryan and told him about everything. I could tell he was skeptical and apprehensive, but he still believed me mostly and was concerned. He's just one of those people who believes everything can be explained by something. That's probably true in this situation as well, but I still couldn't shake these nerves and that horrible feeling brewing inside. He told me they were heading home first thing in the morning, and that he would be back sometime in the late morning, which was at least earlier than they originally planned. Saturday night was a lot like Friday night. I got some food, cuddled up with Rex on the couch, and watched The Office. It was 9:18 that night, and I heard something loud outside the house. It was loud enough that it made me jump, even with the TV super loud. It sounded like an explosion. Then I got a notification on my phone from the garage camera. I pulled it up, and there was a video. My garage door was open in the video, which is crazy. We literally never used the garage door. We only used the garage for storage. We didn't park in it because we both had bigger vehicles. In the video, you can see flashes coming from the driveway. The video doesn't do it justice though. It just sounds like fireworks. I opened the door from the house that led to the garage. I looked in the driveway, and there appeared to be no evidence of fireworks, an explosion, or anything. It was the strangest thing. I saved the video and closed the garage door. Trying to get comfortable in bed after that was not easy. After the incident in the driveway, my heart was racing because I had no idea what had just happened. My brain was confused because I couldn't even process why I was scared. I couldn't tell if I was scared of something insidious in the house that I can't see, or if there was someone actually messing with me. I think I got up 3 separate times and made sure the security alarm was set. Just like the previous night, Rex stood guard at the bottom of the bed, staring at the door, occasionally letting a light growl slip. I ended up falling asleep eventually. I woke up suddenly because someone was pounding on my front door. I looked at the time, and it said 3:39 in the morning. I had the bedroom door shut, so he couldn't get out of the room. I just stayed in bed. I couldn't move if I even wanted to. It wasn't like somebody knocking. It was just a continuous banging on the door. Finally, I got up. Just before opening the bedroom door, I heard "front door open" coming from the security system. I ran to lock the bedroom door. I grabbed my phone to call the cops, but it wouldn't turn on. Whenever I would press the side button to get the screen to light up, it just lit up with a black screen. I think this was the moment I started to cry. I looked over, and I was able to visibly see the doorknob shaking. I started screaming, "Go away!" I called the police and told them someone had broken into the house. They showed up promptly and found nothing out of the ordinary except for the fact that the front door was wide open. Nothing had been stolen, and there was no sign of any foul play at all. I showed the police the video, and they assumed it was most likely some kids lighting fireworks off,
even though there was zero evidence of that in the driveway. As for the door opening, the cops told me it must have been the wind. Yeah, that's it. The wind on a humid July night is gonna shoot open a door that's locked with a deadbolt. That really nailed the case on this one. After the police left, it was nearly dawn. I took Rex and drove to my parents' house. I stayed there until Ryan got home. I told them what happened. They were kind of on the side of the police, but still comforted me anyway. When Ryan got home, I told him everything, and he didn't think I had a brush with anything paranormal as I did, but he did feel like something had happened, and he was concerned. We did stay at that house for a couple more months until we found our new home. Nothing ever happened again. Before that weekend, I had never experienced anything even remotely unexplainable like that, and nothing like that has ever happened since. At the time of writing this, we're almost to the 3-year anniversary of that night. Whatever I experienced that weekend, I just hope I never experience anything like that again. I used to live next door to a bar, and I hated it. Thankfully, it wasn't like right next door. There was a line of trees that went all the way around the bar, so I did have some privacy. However, from my driveway, if I looked just right, I could literally see the side of the bar, and that's where everyone would go outside and smoke. Most of the time, it wasn't that bad. It was only horrible on the weekends, or if the local sports team was playing, which seemed like every other day sometimes. I should also say that at the time of the story, I was working retail. That means I worked most weekends, so they would be partying it up at the bar being loud, and I was trying to sleep. It was a great time. Out of all the annoying nights I dealt with, and there were many, one night specifically still sticks with me, and is probably something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a Saturday night, and my best friend Layla was coming over. She's like a sister to me. We've been friends since elementary school, and still are to this day. Around the time of this story, Layla was working hard trying to set me up with anybody. This was kind of before all the dating apps became popular. The apps would have really helped me break the ice. I'm an incredibly awkward person. I've had a hard time interacting with strangers. The thought of going up to a random woman and asking her out seemed more terrifying than the scariest horror movie you could think of. I'm a massive dork, and I love that about myself. I love my comic books, my collectibles, and more than anything, just relaxing at home. It's kind of hard to meet people when being a homebody is the main part of my identity. That's why Layla was trying to be the ultimate wingman. It wasn't going well, though. I had a few dates, but nothing struck. So, on this specific night, Layla came over for dinner and to hang out for a while until her girlfriend got out of work. We had a great night. She gave me some of her classic Layla dating tips to try out next time I go on a date. Around 10 that night, her girlfriend called her and told her she was leaving work. I walked Layla to her car and said goodbye. As I watched her drive away, I heard loud noises coming from the bar. I glanced over and saw a group of maybe 7 or 8 girls. They were clearly drinking and feeling good. They were laughing and talking loudly. I could clearly hear every word one of the girls was saying to her friend. I shook my head, and just as I was getting ready to turn around and walk back inside, I noticed one of the girls looking in my direction. I looked around to see if she could have maybe been staring at someone else, but it clearly looked like she was staring at me. I didn't react because I still wasn't sure if she was looking at me or something else. All the women outside started to head back into the bar, but this woman stayed back a little bit. It was like she wasn't with the group of girls, even though she was standing with them. Then she waved. She had to have been waving at me. There was literally no one else around. I didn't wave back at first. Then she started waving more aggressively. I hesitantly waved back, and she reacted by blowing a kiss in my direction. All I did was smile and go inside. Clearly, it was just a woman at the bar who may have had one too many drinks. After the weird interaction outside, I went in and started playing video games since I had a weekend off for once. I couldn't think of a better way to spend the evening. Around 1:30 that morning, I heard a knock on the door. I paused the game I was playing. I heard the gentle knock again. I wasn't that freaked out because of the close proximity to the bar. I've had people show up at my doorstep before. Some people in this town really like to party. I was used to weird things like this happening. Just in case it was something serious, I got up and looked out the small window next to the front door. Nobody was standing there. At that moment, it pretty much confirmed that it was just someone from the bar being an idiot. My heart was racing a little bit, just because hearing a knock at the door at that hour is always a little jarring. I didn't get back on my game right away. I was sitting in my front room, reading something on my laptop. I would say maybe 15 minutes had passed since I heard the knock, and I got up to look out the window one more time, just to confirm nobody was outside.
When I looked out the window, I didn't see anybody, but I did notice that the light inside my car was on. When I focused a little harder, I could also see that my driver's side door was slightly open. Again, I wasn't that scared. I was angrier than anything else. It wouldn't be the first time that someone from the bar tried to break into my car and steal something. The joke was on them because I didn't keep anything valuable in my car. The last time this happened, the light inside my car was on all night, and my battery died the next morning. I didn't want that to happen again. I unlocked the front door, went outside, and made my way to my car. I looked in the back seat just to make sure nobody was camping out back there. Once I realized nobody was in the car, I locked it and headed back inside. Once I got inside and locked the door, I realized I could smell something. It was like a lavender perfume or something. It could have been Layla, but she isn't the perfume type, and I don't think the smell would have lingered that long. My thought was that whoever accidentally knocked on the door was probably wearing too much perfume and the smell was still lingering on the front porch. I finished what I was doing on the computer, shut down my video game, and decided to finally head to bed. I still felt a little anxious about everything that happened, but I wasn't scared. I put on a movie in bed and tried to drift off. I don't know exactly how much time had passed until I heard something. I turned the movie off so I could hear better. I thought I could hear someone running around the house outside my room. It sounded like light, delicate footsteps, but they were moving rapidly. I moved closer to the door to listen. I heard the sound of giggling. It was a soft, feminine giggle. When I heard the giggling and unmistakable sounds of running around, I completely shut my cracked bedroom door and called the police. I told them that someone broke into my house, most likely somebody from the bar next door. While I was waiting for the police, every minute felt like an hour. Eventually, I didn't hear the running around anymore. I quietly got up and left the bedroom. I grabbed one of my dad's golf clubs from my closet and started slowly walking through the house. When I got to the kitchen, I froze completely. Just standing in my kitchen was a small blonde woman staring out the window. She was wearing an old-looking, tattered pink dress. Then it hit me. This was the woman from the bar who waved at me earlier that night. Before I could even react, she said while still looking out the window, "Hey buddy, I know you're there." Then she snapped around quickly and stared directly at me. Then she started to run at me. I ran to the bathroom, shut the door, and locked it. She kept knocking on the bathroom door, begging me to open it. It wasn't long after this that the police showed up. They were inside the house and knocking on the door. I opened the door and only saw the officers inside the house. I looked down, and right outside the bathroom was one of my steak knives from the kitchen. After leaving the bathroom, we noticed that the back door was also left open. We figured that she must have run out the back door. The next day, we went to the bar and asked them if they remembered anybody who fit that description, and the owner knew right away. He told us that she was dirty and apparently bothering the guests. Eventually, he had to throw her out of the bar. She was lingering outside for a while, but once he threatened to call the police, she disappeared. After that night, I never saw her again, thank God. I don't know why she targeted me. Maybe she was just crazy and homeless. Maybe she was on drugs. I spent a while trying to figure out how she got into the house. The only time I could think of is when I went outside to shut my car door. She had to have been hiding somewhere near the door and ran inside when I wasn't looking. I'll never forget that night. Thankfully, nothing serious happened, and I'm able to tell my story. I just hope that this woman got the help that she needed, and that she isn't terrorizing more people. I've spent most of my life being alone. That's not a knock on anybody in my family or past relationships. It's just that I've always thrived when I'm alone. Whenever I date, I end up breaking off the relationship before it gets too serious. This isn't a pity party either. That's the way I've always liked it. Being able to focus on myself, I've been able to build my company and find success. My job allows me to travel all over the world and meet people from every walk of life. Basically, I'm kind of like an interior decorator. I meet with clients, talk about ways to design rooms, and help them achieve their vision. I'm currently in my mid-30s, and for the first time in my life, I have a roommate. Last year, something happened to me, and now I never want to be home alone again. Here's why. Years of grinding allowed me to save money, so I was able to buy my dream home. I moved into the house 6 months before the events of the story took place. By this time in my company's life, I was fortunate enough to be able to pick and choose my clients. Because of the high demand, I unfortunately had to turn a lot of people down. With the success of the company, I spent a lot of time working, even when I was home. Unless I was meeting with a client somewhere, I did most of my work right from my home office. A few months after I moved in, I started hearing this weird noise when I was working in my office. I didn't hear it all the time, just sometimes. The noise was like a shuffling sound. I realize that's vague, but that's exactly what it sounded like. Imagine the sound of someone pushing a box in a room next to you. That's kind of what it sounded like. The shuffling was always brief, but loud enough that it would break my concentration whenever I would hear it. The first few times I heard the noise, I ignored it and went back to work. Once it started happening semi-regularly, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One afternoon when I heard the strange shuffling noise, I stopped working and went upstairs to investigate. I remember standing completely still, trying to hear anything I could, but it would always just be me standing there. I felt like I was losing my mind. I'd hear the noise, I would stop whatever I was doing, and run around the house. Once I proved to myself that there wasn't anybody walking around upstairs, I thought that it had to be squirrels that must have gotten into the siding of the house. I remember when I was growing up, a bunch of squirrels got under the roof in my parents' house, and it would keep me up all night. Anybody who has had this happen to them knows how much of a pain this can be, not just because they can be annoying running around, but because of the damage they can cause. Once I had my squirrel revelation, my mind was at peace for a little while. I figured I would just take care of it when I had some time. The noise continued for a few more days. Every time I heard the noise, I would write myself another note to remind me to call someone about the squirrels. I had so many other things on my plate that calling someone to deal with this was the least of my concerns. A few nights later, I worked a lot later than I usually would. I didn't get off of my computer and into bed until after 2 in the morning. While I was lying in bed trying to go to sleep, I heard the shuffling sound again. This was the first time I heard the sound at night. I tried to ignore it and just go to sleep, but this shuffling sound was different from the one I would hear from my office. Usually, I would hear the quick shuffle and then nothing, but now, this sounded like continuous movement. It annoyed me enough that I got up, stood on my bed, and tried listening through the ceiling. The shuffling sound stopped, but I heard something worse. I swear I could hear breathing. Just thinking that seemed ridiculous to me. Then I remembered that my house has a crawl space in it that's like a small attic. The crawl space was very small and kind of hard to even get to that I didn't even use it for anything. It dawned on me that my crawl space was directly over the bedroom. I was terrified. If it was breathing that I heard, I didn't want to think about what that meant. Even though I was scared now, deep down, I still thought I was dealing with squirrels. I got myself hyped up to at least look at the crawl space. I had one of the pull-down strings on the ceiling that released a ladder that led to the crawl space. The string was usually secured next to the door. I was short enough that I had to get a chair to stand on just to release the string so I could pull it. I started to pull the string hard because I thought it might have just jammed. Finally, it opened, and I slowly went up the ladder. All I did was poke my head into the crawl space and look around quickly. I didn't realize how scared I was until I was actually on the ladder. It was dark, and I didn't see anything except for 2 giant beams on each side of the crawl space. After my quick glance, I shut the crawl space door. I was starting to scare myself. I went into the living room and turned on the TV. I couldn't sleep. I just kept thinking about someone being in the crawl space, hiding behind one of those beams. At least with the TV on, I could try to distract my thoughts. I started to doze off eventually. While I was going in and out of sleep, I thought I heard the sound of a door creaking open. The sound was jarring enough that it woke me up instantly. I jumped off the couch and scanned the entire room. I didn't see or hear anything at first. I took a few steps from the living room into the kitchen. I still didn't see anything out of the norm. I walked out of the kitchen and into the hall. At the end of the long hallway was my office. Since the hallway was pitch black, I turned on the light. I half expected to see someone standing at the end of the hall once the light was on. I was so on edge by this point. I slowly continued down the hall and into the office. Once again, everything seemed fine. After finishing my search downstairs, I slowly made my way upstairs. Right away, I noticed that the pole string was dangling down, and even more terrifying, it looked like it was slightly swaying. I thought it had to be in my imagination. I was sure that I secured that string when I closed it earlier. Because of how scared I was when I went up there, I thought to myself that it was possible that I could have left the string hanging, as unlikely as that may be. As I walked down the hall, I noticed my bedroom door was almost completely shut. I always leave it wide open. When I grabbed the door to open it, I noticed that the door made a loud, creaking sound. I was terrified. This was clearly the sound I heard a little while ago. What I couldn't figure out is why. I turned on the bedroom light, and the room looked exactly how I had left it. Just as I was about to leave the room, I noticed something. On the floor right next to my bed looked like a small clump of dirt. I got close to the dirt and bent over to look at it. When I was down on one knee, I thought I could hear that breathing sound again. From my position on one knee, I got down even further and looked under the bed. Lying under the bed, staring directly at me, was a middle-aged man. I screamed and fell back on my two palms. The man didn't move, but he shouted, "Hi, Julie, it's okay." I was trying to get up and run, but I felt like I was stuck in quicksand. He just kept yelling, "It's okay," over and over again. I ran downstairs, grabbed my phone, got in the car, and drove off. There's a 24-hour diner near my house. I drove to the diner and went inside in hysterics. I called the police, and they sent a patrol car to the diner to check on me, and then a few more to the house. When they got to the house, there was nobody there. They searched the entire house thoroughly and didn't find him. They found several empty bottles of water and a small pillow behind one of the pillars. I ended up staying at a motel for almost a month. I was terrified to go back home. I spent a lot of money on home surveillance after that. It's been a year, and that person never resurfaced. I don't know where he went, but I know he's still out there lurking somewhere. I have a theory as to who it was. An old family friend of my dad's who he had to cut off for, let's just say, being attracted to me. I think it was him, but it just looked like a much older version of him. If it wasn't, then whoever he was, he knew my name and somehow got into my house, living in my crawl space. I feel like sometimes even locking your doors isn't enough if someone really wants to get in. About 15 years ago, maybe a little longer, I was in my early 20s and I was living the "I'm gonna be famous someday" life. I was never a good student and I was always the class clown. One thing that I always did well as a kid was make my friends laugh. Instead of going to college or getting a job right after high school, I decided I was going to become a stand-up comedian. Spoiler alert, I did not become a famous comedian, which maybe is the best joke of my stand-up career. Instead, I had nearly a decade of bombing on stage. And even worse than that, the most terrifying single-handed experience of my life happened to me. For a little bit of context, doing stand-up is hard and definitely not lucrative when you're not successful. Not to mention, stand-up comedy was not as popular as it is today. To say it is a grind is an understatement. You question your decisions every time you perform until you get that one crowd that laughs at one of your jokes. The high you experience from the crowd laughing and cheering is intoxicating, and I assume that's why comedians constantly keep grinding. Part of the grind is finding gigs that will pay you, or even just let you perform for a couple of minutes. I was fortunate enough to have several open mics in my hometown, but you're not getting paid at an open mic, and a lot of the time you're sharing the stage with all sorts of other talented people and not just comedians. Nothing kills a comedian's momentum like performing after someone who just poured out their soul with life-altering poetry. After a few years of performing at open mics, I decided to try to reach out to club promoters and local comedians who would get booked for actual shows. Most of the time, these shows would be several hours away if I were lucky. Usually, they were even further than that. I did a few shows, and this is where the grind gets real. It's also where my story takes a very terrifying turn. I didn't have very good luck with these traveling shows. I wasn't getting paid, and I was driving 4 or 5 hours across state lines just for 5 minutes of exposure. Not an ideal situation for someone who was broke and barely had any income coming in. One night, I had an amazing opportunity to perform at a show that was being held 5 hours from where I lived. This show was a competition for comedians trying to break into the mainstream. The first place prize was $1,000, but the real prize for me was that several moderately famous comedians were going to be the judges of the show. It was my chance to show actual comedians that I have talent. The worst part for me when I would make all these trips was that I had a garbage car and an old cell phone that was about as reliable as those big 1980s brick cell phones. I would always think to myself that if something happened, I would be stranded. My drives almost always consisted of nothing but farmland and open fields as far as you could see. Because I was a lazy person, I didn't bother to double-check my printed-out MapQuest directions. Instead, I decided to wing it, something I still regret to this day. I was lost. The directions I had did not match where I was. I had been on a backcountry road for some time, and I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. Thankfully, I always left for the traveling jobs early just in case I got lost. I may have been lazy, but I know myself well, and getting lost was not uncommon for me. It was still daylight when I started driving through a small town. Honestly, calling it a small town might be a stretch. There were a few beat-up old buildings and houses on a street that was maybe a couple of 100 feet in length. Outside of an old gas station, there were a few individuals who looked less than welcoming. I know that's kind of rude to say they were dirty and mean, but they were rude to me. They didn't look like they were using or anything like that. They just looked like they'd been beaten up by life.
I asked where I was and tried asking them if I was on the right track. They were short with me, and after an awkward back and forth exchange, they finally told me where I needed to go. According to the rude townspeople, I was still somewhat on the right track. Somehow, I had missed a turn a while back, but if I stayed straight on this road for a while, eventually I would see the road I needed to be on. I thanked them and filled up my tank before I set off again. While I was pumping the gas, I noticed several of the people I had just talked to were staring at me. It was uncomfortable for sure. It was those dead-eyed stares, and it wasn't just one of them. I counted at least 4 of them just staring and standing completely still like a statue. It made me feel all sorts of weird. I finished up and got out of that small town as fast as I could. I started driving and rehearsing my routine to myself. I kept thinking about how ironically funny my conversation with the townspeople was, and I even tried thinking of ways that I could incorporate this experience into my stand-up routine. Not long after leaving the town, a beat-up white pickup truck flew by me going very fast. I didn't think anything of it at the time. When it was around dusk, I had been driving for nearly an hour since I left the town. There was nothing but trees on the left and right sides of the road. I had that gut feeling that I was probably lost. As I continued down the road, I heard a loud sound from underneath my car, and I started losing control of the vehicle. I knew right away what had happened. It was unmistakable. I had somehow gotten a flat tire. I pulled over to inspect the damage. I couldn't believe my eyes. It wasn't just a flat tire. Both of my front tires were completely obliterated. When I leaned over to take a closer look, I noticed that the tires were impaled with several nails. I pulled out my terrible cell phone, and of course, the service was not good. I tried calling a tow truck, but I had no idea where I was or even what road I was on. I hung up the phone. Instead of panicking, I was starting to get angry that I was going to miss the show. I was stupid, and my priorities were elsewhere. I decided to call one of my friends. I described everything that I remembered about the drive, and I told him about the small town with the gas station. He told me he was going to try to look up where I was and that he would call me back. I didn't know if I should just stay put in the car or I should try walking back in the direction of the town. I decided to stay put in the car because now that it was almost completely dark, it was starting to get cold. It was clear now that I wasn't going to make the show. While I was waiting to hear back from my friend, I noticed 2 bright headlights popping out from the horizon behind me. The headlights stopped moving a good distance from my car and didn't continue in my direction. The car was close enough that the lights were bright and annoying, but far enough away that I could not tell what kind of car it was. I don't know if it was a cop or some local trying to call the police to report a vehicle on the side of the road. If you're wondering why I didn't just call the police, it's because I was driving a car that was not inspected or properly insured at the time, and I wasn't trying to get that ticket in another state. Several minutes went by, and the car never moved. It just stayed parked a good distance behind me, shining those bright lights. After probably a good 5 minutes or so, the bright lights started to get a little closer. The vehicle was slowly moving towards the back of my car. As that was happening, 2 more lights could be seen in front of me, making their way toward me quickly. The loud vehicle stopped inches from my car. Eventually, the car that was behind me was parked directly behind my car, and I still couldn't tell who it was. While I was trying to adjust my eyes to the bright light in my rearview mirror, I noticed that the car doors from the vehicle in front of me were now open. That's when I noticed it was a white pickup truck, the same beat-up white pickup truck from earlier. Before I could notice anyone coming, I heard a loud bang on the driver's window, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the rude man from the gas station. I started to panic because the man was trying to open my car door. Even though it was locked, he was aggressively pulling on the door. He started to beat on the car window. I wasn't sure how long my window would last before it broke. As this was going on, I noticed one of the other men from the car make his way to the passenger side of my car. He also started to aggressively try to open the door. I was trying to yell at them to stop, but it was like they didn't understand what I was saying. They were just grunting and smashing the car doors. The guy at the driver's side door stopped trying to break in for a moment and instead just stood there, staring directly at me. It was just like those vacant stares from the gas station earlier. I can't even begin to explain how horrible that moment was. With no notice at all, he just started screaming. And it wasn't just a normal scream. He was howling and screaming at the top of his lungs. I don't know what came over me at that moment, but I decided that the best course of action was for me to just try and get out of the car and run. I pushed open the door as hard as I could, and thankfully, it was enough force to knock the man over. I ran as fast as I could into the woods, but instead of running blindly into the pitch-black forest, I decided to dive to the ground only several feet into the woods. I hoped that these guys would think I ran deeper into the woods, and thankfully, that's exactly what happened. Moments later, I heard footsteps of several people running by me. When I was sure I heard all of them run by, I quietly got up and ran back to my car. Surprisingly, my backpack and cell phone were still in the car. I grabbed them, stayed low, and just ran as fast as I could down the road. The entire time I was running, I expected them to jump out of the woods, but I never saw them again. About half an hour later, I was able to flag down a passing car.
The woman was uncharacteristically kind. I don't know if I would have been so nice and trusting of a screaming man in the middle of nowhere. She called the authorities and even let me sit in her car until the police showed up. I told the cops everything, but as you might expect, there really wasn't anything they could do. There was no evidence of anything malicious other than some small dents in the car door, and given the condition of my car, the cops didn't really believe the dents were caused by them. I also received a couple of tickets for my car, which is just the icing on the cake for this story. I never found out why those people targeted me or what they wanted with me. Clearly, they were not trying to help. All things considered, I'm lucky that I'm here telling the story. All I can say is just be careful out there. You never know what people are capable of, especially when no one's around to witness. I feel like I'm still not right from what happened to my two friends and I last summer. What was supposed to be an awesome girls' road trip turned into a nightmare that I'm not sure I'll ever fully get over. For a little bit of context, I'm not a spontaneous person. I'm one of those people who has to have everything planned very far in advance, and even then, every little detail needs to be accounted for. It's annoying for some, but it's just how I operate. In late June, I broke up with my boyfriend, who I had been dating for 5 years at that point. It was a messy breakup. One of the things that got me through the breakup was that my friend Sarah had just dumped her boyfriend as well. Having someone to spend time with who was also going through the same situation was such a blessing. Strangely, our bonding through misery and grief helped us both to move on. A few weeks after the breakup, our friend Alyssa invited Sarah and I on this cross-country trip she was going to be taking. Ordinarily, I would never do something like that. The anxiety alone would be enough for me to melt away. But for some reason, this time it sounded like a fun girls' trip. All three of us are fortunate enough to have jobs where we can take time off for a trip like this. Alyssa basically lives on the road. She's always traveling and finding these insane places all over the country. She's the type of woman who will just throw a sleeping bag down in the dirt and sleep under the stars. She's always been such a free spirit and lives for adventure. Sarah and I were much more sheltered. We decided to let Alyssa basically be the captain of our little crew for the trip. She planned it all out, and we were all going to be there for the ride. The first day or so was a little rough for me. I just wasn't used to winging it, but after that, I started really enjoying myself. On the second or third day, we drove by this insane-looking barn. It was definitely abandoned. There was no sign of human life anywhere. The farm looked like it had been completely overgrown by nature. Alyssa was begging us to go inside, but I wasn't feeling it. Alyssa was adamant that clearly nobody lived there. She was obviously correct, but I just couldn't bring myself to trespass. It's also worth noting that I'm just a huge baby. Not wanting to trespass was my excuse, but I was actually scared of someone squatting inside the barn. I had listened to one too many true crime podcasts, and I wasn't about to get kidnapped by some insane backwoods farm man. After a few minutes of arguing, Alyssa gave up, and we decided to keep moving on with our trip. The next week of traveling was amazing. We went sightseeing all over the US countryside. Alyssa showed us places and things that were truly incredible. We partied in bars in small towns, slept on a mountain, and met awesome people from all different walks of life. It really was incredible. The only thing that was a little annoying was that throughout the entire trip, Alyssa kept bringing up that barn. It seemed like any time she could work it into the conversation, she did. While we were driving back to civilization, Alyssa basically begged us to get a closer look at the barn. I don't know if it was the trip that made me come out of my shell a little bit, or just days of Alyssa breaking us down, but I was starting to warm up to the idea. I told her that if it looks like nobody had been there in years, then we could check it out. I was confident that most likely nobody had been there, but I just wanted to make sure I put that out in the universe. I wasn't even 100% sure that Alyssa could get us back there, but that girl is amazing sometimes. She knew exactly how to get there. We spotted the barn around 4:30 p.m. We drove the SUV on the dirt and grass and parked it several yards away from the barn. We didn't want to park right on top of the place just in case some scary farm man was living inside. Alyssa was like a kid on Christmas. She ran to the barn door first. It was crazy in that place. I'm pretty sure the vines were holding the building up. It almost sounded like the place was breathing, but I'm pretty sure that was just the integrity of the building slowly falling apart. The weirdest part was all this strange equipment that was still inside the barn. It didn't look like any farm equipment I've ever seen before, but I'm not a farmer, so maybe it was just older stuff. It looked like stuff you would find in a medieval dungeon. After we explored and took a bunch of pictures inside the barn, Alyssa wanted us to check out the farmhouse that was connected. At this point, I was fully invested, so she didn't have any pushback from me. We had to kick down the door because it was somehow warped into the frame and it wasn't opening. Inside, it was both creepy and sad. It was definitely empty and abandoned. It's not like the previous owner had furniture and stuff like that inside. It was empty, other than a small green table and a green wooden chair.
What was sad was that I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had most likely lived there before. I mean, it was a farm at one point. Somebody had to have lived there before, and now it's just forgotten by history. We explored the house, and I imagined it could have been a cute little house at one point. After a while of just hanging out and talking inside the small house, Alyssa and Sarah both made a crazy suggestion. They suggested that we stay inside the farmhouse that night. Obviously, this seems like it would be a horrible idea, but at that moment, it seemed wild and exciting, and at this point of the trip, I was here for it. We'd been hanging out there so long already that I didn't realize it was almost 7 p.m. We went back to the car and grabbed our stuff. We ate some subs from the cooler, then drank a few beers and talked about the trip some more. Around 9, we started setting up our sleeping bags. We all set our alarms for 6 a.m. so we could get right on the road in the morning. We were all exhausted at this point, so it didn't take us long to pass out. I'm a light sleeper, so I was tossing and turning for a while and going in and out of consciousness. I must have finally fallen asleep briefly, because around 3 a.m., something strange woke me up. I swear, I thought I heard someone make a shush sound. I rose from the sleeping bag and scanned the room the best I could with only the moonlight faintly shining through the vines on the window. I didn't see or hear anything. My best guess was that either Alyssa or Sarah had just been snoring or something. I laid back down and shut my eyes. Almost instantly, I jumped up because there was a loud bang at the door. It was like someone crashed into the door. And remember, we had to break down the door, so it was basically just propped up against the door frame. If this really was a person, they could easily just push down the door. The bang on the door was loud enough that it woke up Alyssa and Sarah. Both were just as startled as I was. We all sat there frozen, basically holding our breaths, listening for another sound. Instead of a loud bang, we started to hear these soft and delicate taps coming from the window, which was on the other side of the room. Then the banging on the door started again. This wasn't the wind or the creaky barn. This was for sure people. People who clearly knew we were inside. We all huddled up together and panicked. It's easy to say what you would do in this situation, but I promise you, you would probably be paralyzed as well. The banging on the door stopped, and then the door was pushed open. 2 skinny men and 1 skinny woman walked inside. I would say all of them were maybe late 30s. They didn't rush in or do anything insane. Instead, they just slowly walked in and stood in front of us. Somehow, just walking in normally like that was scarier. Sarah started to scream, and in response to Sarah's screaming, one of the men started screaming. It was like he was mirroring her scream. The woman of the group started to shush Sarah. The man in the middle of the group started to gesture with his hands, almost like a mime. I didn't even realize until that moment that all 3 of them were holding a weird mask that they put on after the man was done gesturing. The masks were so weird. I know that's vague, but I've never quite seen masks like this before. The guy in the middle put on a mask that was just a giant purple cube. That's it. No face or anything, just a purple cube. The other man, the one who was screaming, put on a mask that kind of looked like a homemade Batman mask that was made of cardboard. Then the woman put on what looked like a medical mask with plastic icicles you would hang up on the holidays hanging on each side of the mask, almost like tusks. They slowly started creeping closer to us, and the more we panicked, the louder and more irritated they became. As we screamed, they started to scream as well. The woman grabbed my shoulders, and because she was so skinny, I was able to push her down. The distraction caused the 2 men to look at the woman. The guy with the purple cube mask shouted that I was going to pay for that. Sarah had a small can of pepper spray on her keychain and started spraying in the direction of the masked people. It gave us enough of a window to run by them. The woman grabbed my ankle as we ran, but I was able to free myself quickly. As I was running away, I looked back and saw the woman reaching behind her in her waistband. I ran to the car as fast as I could. I did not want to wait and find out what she was reaching for. We could still hear them screaming from inside the farmhouse. They didn't chase us for some reason. I remember my vision being a little messed up as well from the spray that must have just been in the air as we ran out of the house. We drove away as fast as we could and made it back home in record time. We didn't actually report this to the police because we figured we're the ones that technically trespassed. Maybe those were the owners, even though I seriously doubt that. One of the scariest parts of this whole ordeal, for me at least, is that we have no idea where those people came from. They just suddenly appeared in the middle of the night. We explored that entire barn that afternoon, and there was no sign of life. No food, no footsteps, no footprints in the dust, no car, nothing. These deranged, mask-wearing lunatics just showed up out of nowhere with the sole purpose of harming us in some way. I'm still not over the mental scars from that trip. I'm happy I got that girls trip out of my system, but I'm good if I never go on another cross-country trip again. I'll settle for a nice staycation next time. A
few years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a road trip across the US. This trip was supposed to be important and special because it was when I planned to propose to my now wife. Unfortunately, that's not the only reason the trip is memorable. One of the happiest memories of my life is also plagued by something that nearly ended both of our lives. This is the first time I'm trying to write this story instead of just telling it verbally, and probably the first time I've written anything since high school. I apologize if it's not the greatest literary work of art you've ever heard. For a little bit of backstory, I have a truck with a large cargo bed. It was more than big enough for her and I to lie down on the air mattress in the bed of the truck. We spent days hiking across the country and sleeping in designated areas in the back of my truck. I had camped a few times as a kid with my family, and I always hated setting up tents and sleeping on the ground. Sleeping in the comfort of my truck felt like a hybrid version of camping, and I was here for it. We both love the outdoors, but we'd be the first to admit that we're not the most nature-savvy people. Every night on the trip was beautiful. We were lucky when it came to the weather. Every night we would fall asleep staring at the sky, and let me just tell you, if you've never gazed at the stars in the wilderness, you need to change that right now. One of the few downfalls of the trip is that my girlfriend was the lightest of light sleepers. Every sound woke her up. We were out in nature, so that means every gust of wind, every bird sound, every tree rustling caused her to wake up. I would always offer her something to help her sleep, but she would always deny it. She said it would make her wake up groggy. Apparently more groggy than being half asleep all night. But it wasn't being a light sleeper that kept her awake on this trip. She has a crippling fear of bears. Ever since one of her coworkers told her that her family was attacked by bears on a camping trip, my girlfriend has been on high alert. Every noise she heard on the trip, she assumed was a bear. Now with the backstory out of the way, I'll share what was almost the last night on Earth for my girlfriend and I. About 3/4 of the way through the trip, I proposed, and she said yes. It was one of the happiest days of my life. With the stress of proposing out of the way, I slept like a baby that night. That next morning, she was the most tired she'd been on the entire trip. When I asked her if she was scared of the noises, she kind of paused and didn't answer right away, which is weird behavior for her. She then went on to tell me that she woke up in the middle of the night because she swore she could hear someone walking on the outside of the truck. She stayed lying down, so she didn't see anyone, but she was convinced someone was walking just outside the truck bed. Every time she tried to sleep, she could hear the sounds of walking, and she was sure she even heard mumbling or talking at some point. I did believe her. Well, I believe that's what she thought she heard. I wasn't dismissive, but I was pretty sure we weren't being stalked or whatever she thought. Before we left in the morning, she gasped outside the truck. When I ran over, she pointed out what looked like a small footprint in the dirt next to the truck. I was probably being ignorant, but I thought it was a stretch to call it a footprint. I asked if it could have possibly been her footprint, and she instantly protested. I didn't argue with her because I could tell she was still freaked out. I made sure I checked my truck before we left and confirmed we didn't have a secret passenger. I did find in the backseat of my truck that my planner was on the seat, and it was open to the page where I had a list of places we were going to stop each night. But I didn't think anything about it. I figured she was looking at it beforehand, or it's possible that I could have left it there. I put it back in my bag, got ourselves ready, and we hit the road. It took a little while for her to get out of her morning fog, but after a large coffee, she was feeling like herself again and didn't bring up the previous night again. We spent the next day just being obnoxiously in love as we hiked through the mountains. Night was approaching, so we set up our little camp nook in the truck bed. I could tell she was a little more uneasy tonight than she had been any other night. It wasn't the bears that were freaking her out. It was the possibility of another person outside the truck. I told her we could sleep inside the locked truck, or even find a hotel if she wanted to, but she insisted that we stay in the truck bed since it was our last night in the wilderness. I decided to stay awake on this night and make sure she fell asleep. It took her a while, but she finally passed out around midnight. I even dug out my old portable DVD player from high school and threw on an old season of Family Guy I had, just to get her mind off the silence of the night. The once beautiful silence was now something she was afraid of, even though she would never admit that. I shut the DVD off and rolled over, trying to get some sleep. Before I even dozed off, I thought I heard something outside my truck. My first thought was a baby bear because it sounded bigger than a raccoon or coyote. I thought it was imperative not to wake her up and cause alarm. Slowly and quietly, I crawled to the wall of the truck bed and peered over the edge. I couldn't believe my eyes. Someone was walking around the front of the truck, a smaller figure with a hood on, and they were mumbling something to themselves. I quickly fell back into the truck bed, since they didn't see me because they were walking in the opposite direction. I didn't know if I should wake her up or not. I thought that would make too much noise, and right now, my main goal was to make as little noise as possible. I thought about trying to tackle the walking person, since they looked a lot smaller than me, but I didn't know if they had a weapon or if someone else was hiding nearby to jump me as soon as I made a move. Keeping my fiancée safe was #1 priority. I was listening intently as the figure walked outside, and I was able to tell that they were walking outside the truck, and they made their way around the truck and walked by the foot of the truck bed. I tried to angle my head to get a look at the person. I couldn't see the face, but I could tell it was a woman. I could see the blonde hair coming out from the bottom of the hood, and I could clearly hear mumbling at this point, and the voice was unmistakably of a woman. I planned to jump out and confront the woman the next time she passed in front of the truck bed. I was somewhat relieved that my fiancée was asleep for all this. I waited several seconds, but she never made her way back to the truck bed. I leaned over the edge of the truck again, and I didn't see her on my side of the truck or the front of the truck. That means she either fled into the woods or was on the other side of the truck that I couldn't see. As fast as I could, I took out my cell phone and typed into my notes, "Don't make a sound. Someone is outside the truck. I'll distract them, take the keys, start the truck, and I'll jump back into the bed." I quietly woke up my fiancée and made sure the first thing she saw was me holding my finger to my mouth, telling her not to make a sound as I held up the phone for her to read. As quietly as I could, I handed her the key. I could tell she was confused and terrified, but thankfully, she didn't make a noise. I grabbed my pocket knife and I jumped outside the truck, trying to scare the intruder away, but nobody was outside the truck. I lowered my guard for a second, and I heard my fiancée yell to me if everything was okay. Just as I was about to answer, I felt intense pain in my ankle. The woman was hiding under the truck, and while I was standing there, she smashed my ankle with a thick tree branch. I stumbled to the ground, and while I was picking myself up, she crawled from underneath the truck, screaming erratically, and she threw the thick branch at me. I put my arms up in defense, and she pulled out what I think was a kitchen knife of some kind, and she started to swing it around crazily. I continued backing away from her insane movements, and once I felt like we were far enough away from the truck, I shouted to my fiancée to start the truck now. She jumped from the side of the truck bed and got to the door. The woman immediately diverted her attention and started running for my fiancé. We were far enough away that she was able to start the truck, and she drove off, leaving a massive cloud of dust. The woman started to scream, and it almost sounded like she was crying. She drove a few feet before turning around and driving straight in the direction of this insane woman. The woman dove out of the way. That's when I finally saw her face. It was my ex-girlfriend. She had some problems when we were younger, but the last I knew, she was doing well. I couldn't believe it. Our breakup was not good. I even had to get the law involved at one point because she would just stalk around the outside of my house in the middle of the night and then claim her only crime was that she was still in love with me. This was also 6 years ago at that point. It's not like this was a fresh wound. Once her hood was off, she fell to her knees and I could see her crying. The usual version of myself would have gone over to make sure she was okay, but not anymore. This woman was clearly not well, and I was not going to take any chances. My fiancé drove by me, and I had more than enough time to open the passenger side door and get in. My ex didn't even try to chase us. We just kept driving. As soon as I was able to get service, I called the police and reported everything. Most surprising was that she eventually just went home a few days later and the police confronted her. To her credit, she didn't deny anything. She even told the police that she wanted to be taken in because she's not well. She claimed that she wanted to kill my fiancé. When they asked if she wanted to harm me, she apparently just cried. The last update I received about her was that she was in some type of institution, but I'm not sure how long that was supposed to be. It's been a few years, and nothing of note has happened since. I rarely think about that night, but whenever I hear stories like this, I'm reminded of that horrible experience, and it makes me wonder if I'll ever see her again. My wife looks her up on Facebook and other social media platforms all the time, but as of the time of writing this, she's still MIA, and I hope she remains that way to me for the rest of my life. This happened when I was 15 years old. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I wasn't old enough to get many on-the-books jobs, so I would occasionally babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and found an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. The post explained that she worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep before I arrived and would remain asleep most of the night. The pay was surprisingly good for what sounded like an easy job. I emailed the woman and got a response about an hour later. She asked for my phone number and called me that evening, and she sounded completely normal. She spoke calmly and answered all my questions. She explained that she had to leave for work before I would arrive, so she would hide a key outside the house. She told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before agreeing to anything. The woman spent several minutes speaking to my mom on the phone. Whatever they discussed seemed to satisfy my mom because afterward, she told me it sounded like a great idea. The babysitting job was scheduled for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street and was surrounded by large trees. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed every light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked to the front porch and checked the hiding spot the woman had described. The key was exactly where she said it would be. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. After setting my backpack down, I turned around and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. Inside was a pretty standard house at first glance. There were family photos on the walls, and a few toys sat near the living room couch. I saw a pink backpack leaning against a chair. There were kids' drawings attached to the fridge with magnets. Everything seemed ordinary. Still, I wanted to know the layout of the house, so I walked through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway leading towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. What I was not expecting to see was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window looking out it, but that fact quickly made the sight more unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing to look at. I stared for several seconds before finally speaking. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was a smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth were missing. I asked who he was, and his smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed out of the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She answered after a few rings, and I explained that there was a man in one of the bedrooms. She sounded confused for a second before acting like she suddenly remembered. That part of it really still sticks with me. Then she explained that it was her brother who had dementia and sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he's harmless. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. If her brother was living there, he should have been mentioned in the ad or on our phone call. Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there for another minute just contemplating my situation. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing remained open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me nervous. I continued farther down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one. Locked. I tried the second one. Locked. The third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The room appeared empty. I couldn't see much because the lights were off. I pushed the door a little farther. It was just an empty room. Feeling stupid for being scared, I continued toward the guest room. As I passed the fridge again, I noticed something strange. The drawings attached to it looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of the drawings had dust sitting on top of the magnet holding it in place. The backpack I'd seen earlier looked faded too. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually been in that house was. The thought made me uncomfortable. I realized that despite being there for almost half an hour, I still hadn't seen a single sign that Rose currently lived there. I hadn't heard her, and I hadn't seen her room. I hadn't even seen any recent toys. I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a small room. I set my backpack on the floor. Then I noticed something. There was no lock on the door. As I turned around to look back into the hallway, there was the man again, standing at the opposite end of the hallway. He was looking at me again, and his smile came back on his face. I hadn't heard him approach. It was like he just teleported there. I honestly don't know how long he had been standing there. The missing tooth was visible even from where I stood. For several seconds, we stared each other down, me looking at him like he was some confused animal and not even an actual person. Then I quickly stepped inside the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm myself down. I knew well of dementia from a young age as my great-grandmother passed away with dementia. This allowed me to justify this man's actions. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. I called my mom 3 times until she finally picked up. I told her of the situation I was in, from the unannounced brother with dementia to the fact that I couldn't even find the child in the house. For a few moments, she was silent. Then she told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing that made me feel relieved and scared at the same time. Scared because even my mom thought something was up here. She hung up after she said she'd be there as fast as possible. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps coming down the hallway toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer until they stopped directly outside the door. Everything went silent, and I stared at the doorknob. I checked my phone, and the woman still hadn't called back to see if everything was okay. I decided to call her myself, but after 3 attempts, she never picked up. While I was waiting, the bedroom door opened a few inches. I couldn't see who was standing outside. The opening wasn't wide enough. I sat there staring at it. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was on the other side didn't enter. I knew it had to be the brother. It was those final, tense seconds where I decided I was getting out of there, and I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I didn't stop running until I reached the street. I crossed to the other side and kept going. I ended up nearly a block away before finally slowing down. I pulled out my phone to call my mom again. Before I could dial, a text message appeared. It was from the woman's number. The message simply asked where I was going. I immediately looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside or at the windows. I didn't see any cameras when I entered the house, yet somehow she knew I had left. That was when I became convinced something was seriously wrong. I called my mom and told her not to come directly to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, she pulled up. I jumped inside and locked the door, and we left immediately. Neither of us ever contacted the woman again. I never figured out who the man really was. I never figured out if Rose actually existed. I never figured out why all the bedroom doors were locked. There's a slight possibility that it was all real and that I was just extremely paranoid and dipped out, but the chances of that are slim to none. Something weird was going on in that house. When I was 15 or 16, I got a summer job cleaning units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through the property manager, who I used to babysit for, and for a high school student, it paid surprisingly well. The job was simple. Whenever a tenant moved out, we would go in and clean the unit to prepare it for the next family. Many of the units had been abandoned in a hurry. Belongings were often left behind, and some places looked as if people had simply gotten up and left one day. I worked alongside a university student I'll call Jen. She was about 20 or 21 and naturally took the lead while I followed her direction. One day, we were assigned a unit on the end of a row. The layout becomes important, so I'll explain it briefly. When you entered through the front door, you walked into the living room. On the right side were 2 sets of stairs, one leading up to the second floor and one behind a door leading down to the basement. The basement stairs turned twice, meaning you couldn't see into the basement from the main floor. The basement itself was just one large unfinished concrete room with a washer, dryer, furnace, and a single hanging light bulb. There were no closets, side rooms, alcoves, or places to hide. When we entered the unit, it was obvious the previous tenants had left in a hurry. The kitchen was filthy and most of their belongings were still there. We spent the first part of the afternoon packing everything into garbage bags and sorting items that could be donated. Once that was finished, we started cleaning. Part of the kitchen cleanup involved pulling the oven and fridge away from the walls and cleaning them thoroughly. We also removed the drawer underneath the oven. When it came time to put it back, we discovered the rails were damaged and it wouldn't slide in properly. For reasons that made sense at the time, Jen and I stood on opposite sides and kicked it until it wedged itself back underneath the oven. When we tried pulling it out again, it wouldn't budge. We both immediately regretted doing that, but we figured the property manager could deal with it later. After that, we split up. Jen headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms while I stayed downstairs removing the glass light fixtures so I could wash them. I was standing on a ladder in the living room when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I called back, to no response. I climbed down and went upstairs. When I found Jen, she was cleaning a bedroom with headphones on. I asked what she wanted. She looked confused. "What, did you call me?" I said. She laughed and shook her head. "No." I shrugged it off and went back downstairs. One thing that always bothered me about that unit was the attic access above the staircase. It was just a square opening in the ceiling leading into a dark crawl space. The cover was missing, so every time I walked underneath it, I found myself looking up into a square of complete darkness. A few minutes later, I heard my name again. This time when I called back, Jen immediately yelled from upstairs, saying, "I didn't call you, you're hearing things." At the time, I agreed with her. It was strange, but I wasn't frightened. Not yet. A little while later, I was standing at the kitchen sink cleaning the light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge, and
and nearly tripped. The oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the floor. Immediately, I thought it was odd. Jen and I had practically kicked the thing into place. We'd also confirmed afterward that it was completely stuck. Still, I just kicked it back in. It took several hard kicks before it wedged itself under the oven again. To make sure, I grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing, it was stuck. Satisfied, I went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I turned around again and almost tripped. The drawer was back out. I hadn't heard anything. Nobody else was downstairs. This time, I felt genuinely unsettled. The drawer hadn't simply slid out. It had been jammed into place. I left it where it was and decided it was the property manager's problem. When I checked on Jen, she was still upstairs cleaning, so I returned to my own work. Eventually, I started reinstalling the clean light fixtures. Since it was a bright summer afternoon, I turned the lights off while I worked. I was standing on a small ladder trying to secure one of the fixtures when the light suddenly switched on. The sudden brightness startled me, and I fell backward on the ladder. A second later, the fixture slipped from my hands and came crashing down. It narrowly missed hitting me in the head. For a few seconds, I just sat there on the floor. I could see the light switch from where I had fallen. Nobody was near it. At the same time, I could clearly hear Jen moving around upstairs. Only a few seconds had passed. There was no possible way she could have run downstairs, turned on the light, and gotten back upstairs. The switch had somehow turned on by itself. At least that's what it looked like. I still wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural. I was just uncomfortable. At that point, I decided I was done working alone and went upstairs to find Jen. When I told her what happened, she looked uneasy. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. A few minutes earlier, she thought she'd heard someone call her name too. It didn't sound like me. We were both officially creeped out. The only task left was sweeping the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down there alone, so we went together. The basement was exactly as I described earlier. One large open concrete room with nowhere to hide. While Jen swept, I sat on the dryer and talked with her. A few minutes later, we finished and headed back upstairs. We were relieved to be almost done. We started gathering our supplies in the living room. I was standing maybe 2 feet from the open basement door when it happened. From below us came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Both of us froze. The footsteps were loud enough that neither of us questioned what we were hearing. Then came something far worse. The footsteps suddenly broke into a run. They were charging up the stairs, fast and loud, coming directly toward us. The footsteps got louder. I looked at Jen, and her face had gone completely white. Neither of us said a word. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the basement door and slammed it shut as hard as I could. Then Jen and I ran. We flew out the front door and across the lawn. At one point, I heard Jen yell behind me, "The key!" I yelled back, "Leave it!" Neither of us stopped until we were on the other side of the complex. I barely remember what happened afterward. Eventually, we returned to the property manager and told her someone had been inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and never went back. As far as I know, she contacted the police before anyone entered the condo. We never told her what we had actually experienced. What could we say? That something invisible had spent the entire afternoon calling our names? Moving objects around? Turning lights on and finally charging up the basement stairs? It sounded ridiculous. Even now, I'm not someone who believes every strange story is paranormal. I've had other experiences in my life that could probably be explained one way or another. This one is different, though. Maybe we imagined hearing our names. Maybe there was some mechanical explanation for the oven drawer. Maybe the light switch malfunctioned. But that basement was empty. There was nowhere for anybody to hide. And those footsteps weren't distant or ambiguous. They sounded exactly like someone running up a staircase directly toward us. Even now, more than 20 years later, hearing someone run up a set of stairs sends me right back to that summer afternoon. I'm still a skeptic, but I never have been able to explain what happened in that condo. When I was younger, I was a hustler and a go-getter, always looking for the next way to make a quick buck, and my mom knew an older couple from a church group who needed help around their property for a couple of weeks. Their names were Richard and Elaine, and they were both in their late 60s, old but not super old. They lived in a pretty rural area about 40 minutes away from my house. They were in one of those older farmhouses with a long gravel driveway and woods behind the property. The deal was simple. The
but I would stay there for a little over a week, help Richard with yard work, cleaning out the garage, moving furniture, painting a fence, things like that, and they would pay me at the end. My mom trusted them because she knew Richard from years back, and Elaine seemed really sweet the first time I met her. She was quiet, but she smiled a lot and kept asking if I was hungry. The house itself was fine. It was what you'd expect an elderly couple to live in a quiet area. Upstairs at the end of the hall was the room I'd be sleeping. On my first day there, Richard showed me around the property and then gave me a verbal list of things we'd work on, and Elaine made dinner. I noticed early on that Elaine didn't talk much, but she always had a neutral to half smile on her face. She asked my name 3 different times, to which Richard just said she forgets things sometimes. I figured he meant normal old person forgetfulness, so I didn't think much of it. That night, I went upstairs around 11 and tried to sleep. Sometime around probably 3 in the morning, I woke up and heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking back and forth outside my room. I knew it. The floorboards creaked every few seconds. Maybe Richard was going to the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't go anywhere. They just passed my door, went down the hall, turned around, and came back. I laid there in the dark listening to it for maybe 10 minutes, and it got increasingly uncomfortable until they seemed to stop right outside the door. I stared at the big, dark gap under the door, and I felt like I could see the outline of 2 feet. After a while, the footsteps moved away again, which confirmed that what I was seeing was in fact 2 outlines of feet. The next morning, I mentioned it to Richard while we were outside working. He didn't look surprised. He just said Elaine sometimes wandered at night because she had bad dreams and got confused, and that I shouldn't worry about it. When I asked if I should lock my door at night, he kind of laughed and said the guest room didn't have a lock because the house was old, so I let it go. But the second night was worse. I woke up again to the same footstep sounds, except this time they were faster. I could hear Elaine muttering to herself in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard my name once, which gave me goosebumps. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times. I was starting to hate that large gap under the door. The doorknob twisted, stopped, and the door opened about an inch. It stayed open a crack for just a moment, and I heard a whispering voice through the crack, but I couldn't make out what was said. Then the door shut again. After that, I had trouble sleeping like I think anyone would in my shoes. In the morning, I told Richard exactly what happened. Once again, he explained it away. His explanation was she probably thought the room was empty and that she had been doing things like that more lately. He said it was embarrassing for her and asked me not to bring it up around Elaine. During the day, she seemed mostly normal, doing things like making lunch, folding towels, and watering plants, which made the whole thing harder to process. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room with this flat, suspicious look. It was like she didn't recognize me, but also didn't like that I was there. On the 4th day, Richard and I were cleaning out a shed behind the house. I noticed a dented metal walker shoved behind some boxes, and next to it was a broken picture frame with dried brown stains on the glass. This is kind of important for later. Later on that same day, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long scratch on the hallway wall, about chest height, like something had been dragged across it. There were also small holes in one of the doors downstairs, like someone had hit it with something. These all seemed like signs of struggle. That night, I put my suitcase in front of my bedroom door. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone, but I figured it would at least make noise if the door opened. Around 2:30, I woke up to the sound of the suitcase scraping across the floor. I looked and saw my bedroom door was halfway open. Elaine was standing in the doorway in her nightgown. I saw her mouth hung open as she was heavily mouth-breathing. I said her name, trying not to sound scared, even though the sight was horrifying. When she stepped into the room, that was when I saw she was holding a kitchen knife at her side. She walked closer to the bed and started whispering something, which I quickly was able to understand as, "You don't belong here." She said it like 5 times. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here." She came all the way to the side of the bed and stood over me with the knife hanging in her hand. I yelled for Richard as loud as I could. Elaine flinched like the sound scared her, then she turned and marched out of the room. Even the stiff way she marched out of the room was terrifying. She slammed the door and marched away. Richard came upstairs maybe 30 seconds later, acting annoyed, like I had woken him up for no reason. I told him she had been in my room with a knife. He kept saying she wouldn't hurt anyone and that she wasn't herself at night. This was officially when him downplaying her behavior began to piss me off. I said I wanted to go home, and he replied it was 3 in the morning and my mom was probably asleep. He said we'll talk about it in the morning. I should have called my mom right there, but I didn't want to make the situation bigger. I pushed the dresser in front of the door after he left and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, Elaine acted like nothing happened. She made pancakes and was smiling again, giving normal grandmother vibes. Richard pulled me aside and apologized, but it didn't feel like a real apology. He said Elaine's memory had been getting worse, which sounded like an understatement. When I asked him if she had ever attacked anyone before, he took a pause. Then he said she had gotten upset with a caregiver once, but that it was handled. That was the first time I realized he had definitely been hiding things from me. I told him a second time that I wanted to leave. He said he understood, but my mom was at work until late, and he would drive me home the next morning after we finished one last job and they paid me. That afternoon, while Richard was outside on the phone, I went looking for my backpack because I wanted to pack early. For some reason, I found it in the laundry room. On my backpack, there was a blood stain clear as day, right on the outer pocket. I called Richard into the room and showed him the blood. He grabbed the backpack, looking a little more angry than I'd seen yet, and he told me he accidentally cut himself earlier and moved my backpack in there while he cleaned up the blood. He finished it off with a "stop worrying." I told him I was calling my mom, and he once again tried to get me to calm down. I went upstairs, packed my bag, and tried calling anyway. The call failed twice, so I texted her to come get me, but it didn't send. Richard also refused to give me the Wi-Fi password. That was when I really started to feel trapped. I had to tank through until she came the next morning. The final night, I didn't even get in bed. I sat fully dressed on the top of the blanket with my shoes on and my bag next to me. I moved the dresser in front of the door again, but around midnight, Richard came upstairs and told me to move it because it was dangerous in case of a fire. I refused at first, and for the first time, I heard him yell. He told me to move the dresser now. I complied and moved it just enough so the door could open. After he left, I waited in the dark with my phone in hand. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elaine downstairs. She was yelling this time. It sounded like she was yelling at Richard. Then I heard glass break. Richard said her name, trying to calm her down, and then there was a loud thud, followed by him shouting in pain. It sounded like she just attacked him. I got up and cracked my door open. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from the staircase from downstairs. Footsteps started coming up the stairs fast. I shut my door and pushed the dresser back as hard as I could. A few seconds later, Elaine hit the door from the other side. The doorknob rattled violently, and she started saying again and again that I didn't belong here. She sounded furious. The door shook as she hit it again and again, and I heard something metal strike the wood, and a piece of the door splintered inward. My sights landed on the window, my only exit, and I decided I was jumping out. I could hear Richard downstairs groaning and calling for her. Whatever she did to him, she was about to do to me, maybe worse. I got the window up and kicked out the screen. There was a small roof over the porch below the window, so I climbed out onto it with my backpack. Elaine was still banging on the door when I jumped out. I dropped from the porch roof into the bushes below. I ran down the gravel driveway without looking back. I could hear the front door open behind me, and Elaine was yelling from the porch. She was holding what I could only guess was a fireplace poker in one hand. I kept running until I reached the road, where I finally was able to call 911 with service. The police and an ambulance showed up maybe 15 minutes later. Richard had a cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to stop her. Elaine was taken away by paramedics. The police got a hold of my mom, and she arrived as soon as she could. Richard later told my mom that Elaine had been getting worse for months, but he didn't want to put her in a facility because he felt guilty. He thought he could manage it himself. He also admitted she attacked 2 caregivers before me. If he wasn't an old man, my mom likely would have slapped him in the face after she heard all that. I still think about how many chances I had to leave, and how many times I ignored the obvious signs because I didn't want to seem dramatic. Honestly, I feel like we as humans try to hold out our hope that things are still normal for as long as possible, that we really don't see the actual danger we can be in until it's almost too late.